Tonight, we're exploring something that rarely appears in history books, how ancient warriors found inner peace after battles. It's not about the war itself, but about what happened afterward, the rituals, the journeys, the paths they walked in search of calm. It's a story of human resilience that spans centuries and cultures. It's worth staying until the end because you'll discover ancient practices that still make sense today, and maybe find a lesson or two about how we deal with our own challenges. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. The silent return. Victory always had two sides. On one side, the triumphant parades, the celebrating crowds, the names carved in stone. On the other, something few people stopped to observe, the silence of those who returned. Not the silence of shyness, but that kind of quietness that comes from within, from someone who saw the world change and changed with it. Think about it this way. You leave home as one person, you spend months, maybe years, in distant places facing challenges that test every part of your being. And when you return, everyone expects you to be the same, but you're not. And then begins a different journey, not of conquest, but of reconnection. It's about this journey that we're going to talk today. Not about the horror of war, but about the wisdom that ancient civilizations developed to help their warriors find peace again. Rituals involving water, fire, earth. Communities that understood that victory and healing went hand in hand. Imagine the tranquil banks of the Tiber River at dusk. The water reflecting the last rays of sun, creating a golden mosaic that danced gently with the current. The smell of pine from nearby hills mixed with the damp aroma of earth along the banks. A veteran of the Roman legions sat there, barefoot, his feet touching the still, warm grass. The sound of the water was constant, almost hypnotic. An eternal whisper that seemed to say the world continued, regardless of distant battles. This man had a name, a family, a story, but for now, he was just one more seeking what war had taken. The feeling of being at home within himself. Rome understood this better than we imagine. It was no coincidence that the city was full of thermae, public baths that were much more than places of cleansing. They were sanctuaries of transition, spaces where the noise of the world stayed outside and where, in the gentle steam and enveloping warmth, a warrior could begin to leave behind the weight he carried. There's something deeply wise about that, isn't there? The idea that you need a physical space to process an internal transformation. That healing doesn't just happen in the mind, but in the body too. In the sensation of hot water, relaxing tense muscles. In the slower rhythm of breathing when you can finally let your guard down, and it wasn't just in Rome. Crossing continents and centuries, you find similar patterns. Mongol warriors returning to the silent vastness of the steppe, where the infinite horizon and constant wind created a different kind of meditation. Japanese samurai seeking mountain temples, where the only sound was wind through the pines and the occasional distant bell. Vikings sailing back to fjords where calm water mirrored snow-covered mountains, creating a symmetry that seemed to restore some internal order. Have we lost a bit of that today? This notion that transitions need time, space, rituals that mark the passage from one state to another? The truth is that the ancients didn't have the word PTSD. They didn't have psychologists or therapy as we know it. But they had something that might be equally powerful. Collective systems of recognition and reintegration. Communities that knew how to wait. Families that understood that the warrior needed time before becoming father, brother, son again. In ancient Greece, there were specific festivals for this. They weren't just celebrations of military victory. They were rituals of purification and reconnection. Warriors participated in silent processions, walking barefoot along sacred paths. The contact of feet with cold earth, the intentional slowness of pace, the collective rhythm. All of this had a purpose. It was a way of saying, you've been away, but the earth is still here. You still belong to this place. And there's that fascinating thing about how different cultures used natural elements in this process. Water for purification, present in practically all traditions. Fire for transformation, burning something symbolic, letting go. Earth for grounding, agricultural work, construction, planting. Air for renewal, rituals in high places, mountains, where the wind blows strong and clean. Curious how nature was always part of the answer, isn't it? The Romans had a particularly interesting ritual. When a soldier returned from campaign before entering the city, he went through a process called lustration. It involved symbolic sacrifices, purification with water, and most importantly, a period of time outside the city walls. It wasn't punishment, it was recognition. Recognition that the person needed an intermediate zone between the battlefield and civilian life. A liminal space where transformation could happen at its own pace. Imagine that. You camp on the outskirts of Rome, can see the walls, hear the distant sounds of the city, smell the smoke from bakeries. But you're not inside yet. It's not time yet. You have time to process, to remember who you were before, to begin integrating who you've become. Your companions are there with you. You share silences, memories, small personal rituals. There's no rush. Something to reflect on. When was the last time we allowed ourselves that kind of transition? We change jobs, cities, life phases, and simply expect to move on immediately. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. But back to our ancient warriors. There's a specific story that illustrates this well. A Roman soldier named Marcus Aurelius, not the philosopher emperor, another Marcus Aurelius, a common name at the time, who spent 15 years serving on the empire's frontiers, 15 years away from home. When he finally received honorable discharge, he didn't rush back to his village. Instead, he spent 6 months walking. He could have made the journey in weeks, but he chose the long road. He stopped in small villages, worked in exchange for food, slept under the stars. He observed the different rhythm of civilian life, children playing, merchants negotiating, weavers working at their looms with that rhythmic, comforting sound. And when he finally arrived home, he was no longer just a soldier returning. He was someone who had made the way back to himself. Fascinating to think about, isn't it? How the physical journey can be a metaphor, or even a facilitator, of the internal journey. The Greeks had a concept for this, nostos, the word that gave origin to nostalgia. But originally, nostos didn't just mean longing. It meant the journey of return itself, the process of coming home, with all its layers. And they understood that this journey was as heroic as going to war. Maybe even more. Homer's Odyssey is basically about that. Odysseus takes 10 years to return from Troy. 10 years. And each obstacle, each island, each mythical creature, they're externalizations of internal struggles. The temptation to forget who you are. The fear of not being recognized when you arrive home. The doubt about whether you still belong to the place you left. Beneath the epic fantasy, there's a deeply human truth about transition and reintegration. And here we find the first great wisdom of these ancient civilizations. They knew you can't simply flip a switch. You don't go from warrior mode to civilian mode overnight. You need time, rituals, community, nature, purpose. So as we advance through this journey across the centuries, we're going to find warriors in every corner of the world doing essentially the same thing, seeking paths back to peace. And the most incredible part, many of these ancient practices have direct parallels with what modern science on trauma and resilience recommends today. But that's a story for the next chapters. For now, just let this idea land softly. Victory was never just about winning the battle. It was always about finding the way back home. Not just the place, but the state of mind. Waters of transformation. Rome had an almost sacred relationship with water. It wasn't just a practical matter of hygiene, it was something much deeper. The city was crossed by aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mountains, and these monumental structures were seen as gifts from the gods. The water that flowed through them didn't just sustain life, it had the power to renew it. For a legionary returning from years on the frontiers of Germania or in the sands of Africa, the first stop wasn't his home. It was the nearest bathhouse. Imagine the scene. You cross the gates of Rome after months of marching. The dust from the road still clings to your skin, mixed with sweat and memories of distant places. Your muscles are stiff, not just from physical fatigue, but from that tension that accumulates when you need to always be alert, always ready. And then someone, a veteran perhaps who's been through this, takes you by the arm and says, "Come." First, the water. Roman thermae were true healing complexes. They weren't just a single bath, but a journey through different temperatures and environments, each with its purpose. You started in the apoditerium, the changing room. There was already an implicit ritual there, removing your armor, taking off your uniform, leaving behind the external symbols of your military identity. You were left with just a simple towel. In that moment, you were no longer a soldier, you were just a man seeking cleanliness. The first space was the tepidarium, the warm room, neither hot nor cold. An intermediate temperature that prepared the body. The air there was humid, laden with gentle steam that you felt entering your lungs with each breath. The light filtered through small high windows created an atmosphere of comforting dimness. You sat on warm marble benches, closed your eyes, and simply breathed. There's something about starting slowly, isn't there? Not shocking the system, but gently inviting it to change. Then came the caldarium, the hot room. Here the temperature rose, the steam became denser. Your body began to sweat, to release toxins, to relax layer by layer. The sweat that ran wasn't just physical. There was a sensation of deeper purification happening. Difficult memories seemed to dissolve in the heat, as if they could be sweated out. The Romans understood something we sometimes forget. The body holds memories. Tension in the shoulders, tightness in the chest, that feeling of always being ready to fight or flee. And these physical memories need to be released, not just processed mentally. In the caldarium, men sat in silence, side by side. There was no pressure to talk. The steam created a kind of privacy, even in shared space. You saw only silhouettes around you, hearing deep breaths and the occasional sigh of relief when a muscle finally relaxed. And then came the part that many considered the most transformative, the frigidarium, the cold room. After all that heat, you plunged into a pool of ice-cold water, fed directly by the aqueducts that brought water from mountain springs. The initial shock took your breath away, but then something extraordinary happened. Your mind became completely present, anchored in the moment. There was no space for memories of the past or worries about the future, just the intense and immediate sensation of now. Your heart raced, blood ran faster, you felt alive in a raw and fundamental way. When you emerged from the cold water, there was a mental clarity that didn't exist before, as if the fog had cleared. Do we underestimate the power of intense physical sensations to reset our minds? But the process didn't end there. There was the unctuarium, the massage and oil room. Here, skilled masseurs worked tense muscles with perfumed oils, lavender, rosemary, frankincense. Human touch, firm but gentle, completed the reconnection process. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about reminding your body that it no longer needed to be in constant guard, that it was safe to relax. The aroma of the oils also played its role. Smells have that peculiar power to access deep memories and emotions. Romans specifically chose fragrances that had associations with home, with peace. Lavender growing in childhood gardens, rosemary from mother's kitchen, small olfactory anchors bringing you back to what was familiar and safe. And during this entire process, which could take hours, there was one fundamental thing happening: community. The thermi weren't solitary places. You saw other veterans, each on their own journey through the rooms. Sometimes a look of recognition was exchanged, no words needed, just that silent understanding. I know where you've been, I'm also coming back. There were also the older veterans, those who had made this transition years ago. They appeared at the thermi not so much for physical cleansing, but for the role they played. They were reassuring presences, living proof that it was possible to return to civilian life. That inner peace wasn't a myth. Sometimes they shared stories, not about battles. You heard enough of those in the army, but about the afterward. About how a man who couldn't sleep at night found solace working with wood, the repetitive rhythm of carving calming his mind. About how another discovered that helping to build a new aqueduct gave him a renewed sense of purpose. About how someone's daughter, whom he barely knew when he left for war, became his greatest teacher of patience and presence. These stories were balms. They didn't offer easy solutions, but they offered something perhaps more valuable: hope grounded in real experience. The Romans also had collective purification rituals that went beyond individual thermi. The lustratio exercitus was one of the most significant, a purification ceremony of the entire army before being formally discharged. It happened in an open field, usually near a river or natural spring. Soldiers gathered at dawn when the air was still fresh and the light had that soft, rosy quality. A priest conducted the ceremony, but its heart was simple: water, fire, and intention. First, water was sprinkled over the soldiers, not just a bit. They were completely soaked, as if being baptized into a new life. The cold water of dawn raised goosebumps, awakened the body, symbolized cleansing not just physical, but spiritual. Then small bonfires were lit. Each soldier had the opportunity to throw something into the fire: a piece of cloth he had carried during the campaign, an improvised symbol, sometimes just a handful of earth from the place where they had fought. The act of letting go, of seeing that transform into smoke and ash, had real psychological weight. The fire crackled, smoke rose in lazy spirals until disappearing into the growing sky, and with it symbolically what you were ready to release. Funny how humanity has always returned to these basic elements in moments of transition: water, fire, earth, air. As if nature had answers that civilization, however advanced, couldn't give alone. There was also an aspect of Roman purification that was deeply personal: the private rituals that each man created for himself. Some went to the Tiber before dawn, plunged into the cold river when the city still slept, letting the current symbolically carry away what they wanted to release. Others walked to specific temples, small shrines on the city's outskirts dedicated to minor gods, quiet places where they could speak in low voices or just sit in silence. One of the most touching rituals that appears in ancient records was that of the last vigil. A veteran spent an entire night awake in a significant place, perhaps where he had trained before leaving, or a garden he remembered from his childhood. He stayed there, alone with his thoughts, watching the stars move slowly across the sky. It wasn't about torture or penance. It was about keeping watch one last time, but now watching over himself, observing his own thoughts and feelings without judgment. And when the sun rose, that vigil ended. It was a new day, a new life. There's a beauty in that simplicity, isn't there? It doesn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it's just about being present with yourself, completely, for one night. Roman women also had their role in this process of purification and reintegration, though history speaks less about it. Wives, mothers, sisters. They prepared domestic rituals, baths with specific herbs, meals made with foods the soldier loved as a child, small domestic altars where offerings were made to the lairs, the protective spirits of the home, asking them to welcome back the son, the husband, the brother. There was wisdom in involving the family in the process. It wasn't just the warrior who had to make the transition. The family also needed to learn to receive him back, understanding that he was no longer exactly who had left. And then there was an aspect of Roman purification that was perhaps the simplest, but also the most profound: time. The Romans institutionalized transition periods. A soldier wasn't thrown back into civilian life overnight. There were phases, each with its rituals and expectations. First, the days at the thermae and temples, then a period where you still received your military ration but had no duties. You could wander the city, relearn its rhythms, reconnect with places and people. Only after that, sometimes weeks or months later, were you formally considered a civilian again. This gradualness respected human nature. It recognized that transformation doesn't happen in a day, but in layers, like an onion being peeled, one film at a time. When you think about it, there are interesting parallels with modern practices of mindfulness and somatic therapy, aren't there? The emphasis on bodily sensations, on rituals that mark transitions, on community as the basis of healing. The Romans didn't have these terms, but they were applying very similar principles. A story that illustrates this well is that of Lucius, a centurion who spent 20 years in the legions. When he returned to Rome, he couldn't stay in enclosed spaces. Something about it made him agitated, ready to fight. His nights were restless, full of startles. An older veteran took him to the thermae and established a routine. Every morning, before dawn, they went together. They didn't talk much. They just went through the complete cycle of the rooms, always ending with a plunge in the frigidarium and then sitting in silence in the bathhouse garden while Rome awakened around them. It took months, but gradually Lucius began to relax. His body learned there were safe places. His mind began to slow down. And eventually, he could sleep through an entire night without waking in panic. It wasn't magic. It was repetition, ritual, patience, and the silent presence of someone who understood. Do we give enough value to this kind of simple but constant accompaniment? And there's one more fascinating thing about Roman thermae. They were democratizing. Rich and poor bathed in the same spaces. A senator might be in the hot room next to an ex-enlisted soldier. In nakedness and steam, social hierarchies dissolved. Everyone was just human seeking cleanliness and peace. This created a temporary equality that had a powerful psychological effect. For a veteran who might have felt displaced or inferior for not having wealth or position, the thermae offered a reminder: you belong here as much as anyone else. Your experience, your humanity, has value. As the afternoon advanced in the thermae and the golden light of the Roman sun filtered through the high windows, creating dancing patterns on the water's surface, something happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but it was real. It was the beginning of accepting that you had changed, but that change doesn't mean breaking. That it's possible to carry difficult experiences and still find moments of tranquility. That the journey back home is long, but there are resting places along the way. And perhaps most importantly, you don't need to do this alone. The waters of Rome continued flowing long after the empire fell. Some of those aqueducts still function today 2,000 years later, bringing water from the same springs in the mountains. It's a continuity that has something comforting about it, as if saying, the world continues, the water keeps flowing, and there's always a chance for purification, for new beginnings, for finding calm, even after the most violent storm. Only there's one detail about all this Roman wisdom. It didn't arise from nowhere. It was influenced by even older practices from cultures that the Romans themselves encountered and absorbed. The Greeks, of course, but also Egyptians, Persians, and peoples who barely appear in historical records, but who left their marks on healing practices. And if we look to the east, to the steppes of Asia, we find completely different but equally profound approaches to helping warriors find peace. But that's a story for the next chapter. The vastness that heals. If Rome found healing in water, warriors of the steppes found it in immensity, not in elaborate temples or luxurious baths, but in the landscape itself. Vast, silent, eternal. The Mongolian steppe is the kind of place that transforms a person just by looking at it. There are no dramatic mountains breaking the horizon, no dense forests hiding what comes next. It's just space. Miles and miles of undulating grasslands, immense sky, and a silence that isn't absence of sound but a presence of its own. For a Mongol warrior returning from campaigns that could have lasted years, crossing deserts, conquering cities, fighting in lands where even the language was strange, this return to the steppe was the beginning of the true journey home. Imagine the scene. You ride for days, leaving behind the last conquered villages, the last fortifications. Gradually, the landscape changes. Fewer trees, fewer constructions, more sky. And then, finally, you're back. The steppe stretches in all directions, undulating gently with the eternal wind. The first impulse wasn't to run to the ger, the traditional tent where your family waited. The first impulse was to stop, dismount, and simply stand there, feeling the wind that never stops blowing across those plains. A wind that carries the smell of sagebrush and dry grass, mixed with that indefinable aroma that only open space has. A wind that doesn't respect barriers, that passes through you as if you were transparent. The Mongols had a word for this, soothe. It means something like soul of the wind or essential spirit. They believed the steppe wind carried with it a force of renewal. That if you stood long enough letting the wind pass through you, it would carry away what was no longer necessary. Heavy thoughts, memories that stuck, that feeling of carrying the world on your shoulders. It wasn't magic, it was something more subtle. It had to do with scale, with perspective. When you're standing on the steppe, under a sky that seems twice the size of any sky you've ever seen, your individual concerns begin to seem smaller. Not insignificant, never that, but contextualized. You're a small part of something much larger, and there's a strange comfort in that. Can physical immensity really alter our emotional immensity? Mongol warriors practiced something we could call horizon meditation. It wasn't formalized like meditative practices we know today, but the principle was similar. You chose a point on the horizon, perhaps a distant rock formation, or just where the earth met the sky, and you simply looked. You didn't try to think about anything specific, didn't force insights, just observed, The horizon never changed, but was also never exactly the same. The light altered, clouds passed, the grass changed tone as the wind bent it in different directions. And you remained there, breathing, observing, letting time do its work. Hours could pass like this. Sometimes an entire day. And gradually, not suddenly, never suddenly, something loosened inside you. A tension you didn't even know you were holding. A thought that had been running in circles finally quieted. There's something deeply therapeutic about doing nothing, about simply being present in a place where time seems to move differently. Another crucial aspect of Mongol healing was the relationship with horses. For steppe nomads, horses weren't just transportation. They were companions, part of the family, extensions of one's own identity. A warrior spent more time with his horse than with any person, and when you returned from campaign, there was a specific ritual. You cared for your horse before doing anything else. Not out of obligation, but because it was part of the return process. You brushed the animal's coat with slow and deliberate movements, removing the dust of the journey. You felt under your hands the strong muscles, the warmth of the living body. You checked the hooves one by one, carefully. You offered fresh water, watched the animal drink with those reassuring sounds of contentment, then brought forage, stayed there while it ate, perhaps resting your hand on the horse's neck, feeling the deep, calm breathing. This ritual had layers of meaning. On the surface, it was practical care. But underneath, it was something more. It was a way of slowing down, of returning to simple and meaningful activities. It was reconnection through touch and care. It was remembering that you still knew how to be gentle, how to nurture, how to be present for another living being. The horses, in turn, seemed to understand. A horse that has known its rider for years can sense subtle changes, and in the calm way they remained there, accepting the care, there was a form of silent communication, as if saying, "It's all right, we're home, you can rest now." Curious how animals sometimes can offer a kind of comfort that human words don't reach, isn't it? And you, what do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments when you have a moment. But beyond horses and horizon, there was another fascinating Mongol practice: long solitary rides. When a warrior returned particularly disturbed, which elders recognized by subtle signs, a stiffness in the gaze, a constant restlessness, they suggested a journey, not a journey with a specific destination, a journey of movement. Take your horse, some provisions, and simply ride through valleys, low hills, along rivers that cut through the steppe, without hurry, without objective, beyond movement itself. There was deep wisdom in this. Physical movement helps process emotions in ways that staying still cannot. When you ride for days, your body enters a rhythm. The sway of the horse, synchronized breathing, the repetitive pattern of muscles working, and in that rhythm the mind also begins to organize itself. Thoughts that were tangled begin to unravel. Memories that were stuck emerge, are looked at, and then can be left behind, absorbed by the movement and landscape. During these rides, a warrior could spend days without seeing another person. It was just him, the horse, and the steppe. At night, he camped wherever he was when the sun began to set. He lit a small fire, not for warmth, as summer nights were mild, but for company. There's something primordial about sitting beside fire, watching flames dance, hearing the soft crackling of wood. The night sky on the steppe is something difficult to describe for those who've never seen it. Without light pollution, with nothing between you and the cosmos, the stars aren't just points of light. They're an overwhelming presence. The Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon, a brilliant band of countless suns. You can see Jupiter's satellites with the naked eye. Meteors streak across the sky every few minutes, and lying there looking up, something happened. A cosmic perspective settled in. Your battles, however intense they had been, were tiny moments in the vast tapestry of time and space. This didn't make them unimportant, Sada, but it put them in context. You were part of something much, much larger. There's something comforting about feeling small before the universe, as if the weight of individual responsibility was shared with something infinitely more vast. The Mongols also practiced a form of storytelling that was part of the healing process, but not in the way you might imagine. They weren't stories about the battles they had fought. Those didn't help. They were ancient stories passed from generation to generation about mythical heroes and impossible journeys. These stories were told around the fire, usually by an elder. The rhythm of the narrative was deliberately slow, almost hypnotic. The storyteller's voice rose and fell like wind in grass, and the stories always followed similar patterns. A hero faces immense challenges, gets lost, finds help in unexpected places, and eventually returns transformed. What these stories did was create a map, not a geographic map, but an emotional and psychological one. They said, there's this difficult journey you're making back to yourself others have made before. There's a structure to it, there's a path, and there's an ending, a good ending. Joseph Campbell would call this the hero's journey. The Mongols didn't have that term, but they deeply understood the principle, and knowing that your personal struggle was part of a universal pattern, of a narrative that humanity has been telling forever, offered a specific kind of comfort. Your difficulties weren't unique in the sense of being strange or wrong. They were unique only in details, but universal in structure. Another fascinating practice was what we could call meditative manual work. Warriors returning from campaign often spent time making things with their hands, repairing equipment, not because it urgently needed it, but for the process. Tanning leather, braiding ropes, carving wood for saddles or stirrups. The repetitive rhythm of these activities had a calming effect. Your hands, which had held weapons, now created useful things. There was a symbolic restoration in this, from destructive to constructive, from taking life to sustaining life. And while hands worked, the mind could wander freely, but in a more organized way. It wasn't like the anxious spirals of thoughts that came at night. It was a gentler kind of processing, facilitated by the rhythm of manual work. Interesting how such different cultures, Romans with their baths, Mongols with their steppes, arrived at similar conclusions about the importance of repetitive rituals and physical presence in the healing process. Mongol women also had specific roles in this reintegration process. When a warrior returned, his wife or mother didn't bombard him with questions. There was a tacit understanding. He would speak when ready. Meanwhile, they created space. They prepared his favorite foods. Not elaborate banquets, but simple dishes he remembered from childhood. Fermented mare's milk, the airag that was sacred drink on the steppes. Lamb cooked slowly with herbs, smoked cheeses. Each flavor was an anchor to home, to safety, to a time before. And there were the songs. Mongol women had the tradition of kume, throat singing, a form of singing where one person produces multiple notes simultaneously. The sound is deep, resonant, almost superhuman. They say it imitates sounds of nature. Wind in mountains, running water, distant animal calls. At night, these songs filled the air around the ger. They weren't songs about war or glory. They were songs about the land, about seasons, about the continuity of life. And there was something in those deep vibrations that seemed to reach a primitive part of the brain, calming overloaded nervous systems. The Mongols understood something that modern science is only beginning to confirm. Vibration and sound have real physiological effects. Specific frequencies can literally alter brainwave patterns, reduce cortisol, induce states of deep relaxation. They didn't know the neuroscience behind it, but they knew what worked. There's also that fascinating tradition of the first day of silence. When a warrior arrived back, the entire first day was spent in silence, not by rigid rule, but by respected custom. Nobody asked him questions. Nobody expected him to report his experiences. It was simply a day to be present, to reaccustom to the sounds, smells, and rhythms of home. He could sit outside the ger observing the movement of the camp. Children playing, women working with felt, older men repairing tools, dogs wandering in search of scraps, goats and sheep grazing nearby. The normal, peaceful, infinitely comforting rhythm of life continuing, and in that silence, something began. Not a complete healing, that would take time, but a beginning. The recognition that this place still existed, that while he was away facing chaos, this remained. And now he could be part of it again. Do we give enough value to periods of intentional silence in our own lives? A story that well illustrates Mongol wisdom is that of Temujin, not Genghis Khan, another Temujin, a common name, who returned from a particularly brutal campaign in China. He had seen things he couldn't process, had done things that haunted him. The tribe's elders recognized the signs. They suggested the long ride. Temujin initially resisted. He just wanted to forget, move on. But eventually he accepted the advice. He rode for 40 days, alone, without destination. He crossed the steppe in all directions. It rained on him. The sun burned his skin. He slept under the stars, ate raw fish from rivers, talked to his horse because there was no one else to listen. And at some point, he couldn't say exactly when later, the weight began to diminish. The memories didn't disappear, but they lost their sharp claws. He could look at them from a safe distance, recognize them as part of him, but not his entire identity. When he returned, thin and sunburned, there was a quietness in him that didn't exist before. It wasn't the quietness of suppression, but of acceptance. He had made the journey outward, and more importantly, the journey back. And this is something that appears repeatedly in Mongol healing traditions: movement and return. You need to move away to be able to return properly. You need distance to gain perspective. You need solitude to learn to be in community again. The concept of space, both physical and emotional, was central to how Mongols understood healing. The steppe offered that space naturally. There was no pressure of crowded cities, compressed social expectations, the constant weight of always being on. There was just you, the land, the sky. And in that vastness, paradoxically, it was easier to find the way back to your own center. Funny how sometimes we need the biggest possible space to find the most intimate place within ourselves. The Mongols also had specific rituals to mark transitions. When a warrior finally felt ready, and only he knew when that moment was, there was a small ceremony. Simple, but significant. He took a piece of his armor, something small but symbolic, and buried it in the steppe. Not in a marked place. Just somewhere. The idea was to leave that part of himself in the earth, literally. Not to forget, never to forget, but to recognize that chapter had ended. And then, for the first time since returning, he entered the main ger and sat in the place of honor. The family gathered, and someone, usually the matriarch, simply said, "Welcome home." 2 words, but loaded with meaning. You made your journey. You processed what you needed to process. Now you can truly be here with us, again. Only there's one detail about all this steppe wisdom. It didn't exist in isolation. The Mongols, in their conquests, encountered other cultures, with their own healing practices. And something interesting happened. There were exchanges, influences, absorptions, particularly when they reached the East and encountered Buddhist and Taoist traditions with their own deep understandings about mind, suffering, and peace. And from this mixing emerged even more refined practices. But this story of how warriors in East Asia integrated philosophy, meditation, and martial arts to create complete paths of personal transformation, that's something that will have to wait for the next chapter. The path of the silent warrior. While the Mongols found healing in the physical vastness of the steppe, the samurai of Japan discovered something different: inner vastness. Not through great open spaces, but through meticulously cared for gardens, silent rooms, and practices that transform the mind itself into a sanctuary. Feudal Japan had a unique relationship with war. The Bushido, the way of the warrior, wasn't just about combat techniques. It was a complete philosophy of life that integrated ethics, aesthetics, and what today we call contemplative practices. And crucially, this philosophy included not just how to fight, but how to exist after the fight. Imagine a samurai returning from months of campaign. Perhaps he served his daimyo, his feudal lord, in some territorial dispute. Perhaps he saw friends fall, made impossible choices, carried the weight of decisions that had no right answers. He returns to the castle, or to the village, or to the small mountain temple where he grew up. And the first thing he doesn't do is talk about it. Instead, there's a different ritual waiting for him: the tea ceremony. The shanoyu, as it's formally called, is much more than drinking tea. It's meditation in movement, a practice of total presence that was refined over centuries, specifically to cultivate inner calm. And for warriors returning from battle, it served as a bridge between external chaos and internal peace. The ceremony happens in a special room, the chashitsu, deliberately small and simple. The walls are rice paper that filter daylight into soft, uniform luminosity. The floor is covered with tatami, straw mats, that have that comforting smell of dried grass. There's an alcove, the tokonoma paghao, with a single flower arrangement and perhaps a scroll with calligraphy chosen specifically for the season and moment. You enter through the low door, so low you must bow regardless of your social position. It's a symbolic act, leaving your ego outside. Inside, everyone is equal. The most decorated samurai and the humblest monk sit side by side. The host, usually an experienced tea master, moves with a precision that seems choreographed, but is actually the result of years of practice, making each gesture natural. Every movement has purpose. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is wasted. First, the utensils are cleaned, not because they're dirty, they were already cleaned before, but as part of the ritual. You watch hot water being poured over the bamboo spoon, over the ceramic bowl, the soft sound of water, steam rising in lazy spirals. Already here, something begins to calm within you. Then the green tea powder, matcha, is measured carefully. The color is a vibrant green, almost unreal. It's mixed with hot water using a bamboo whisk, quick but controlled movements, creating a whispering sound that fills the silence. A light foam forms on the surface. The bowl is rotated, always twice, always in the same direction, and offered. You receive it with both hands, bow in gratitude, rotate twice also before drinking. The tea is bitter, but in a clean way. The temperature is exact, hot enough to feel, but not to burn. And during this entire process, which can take an hour or more, your mind has no space to wander. You're completely present, observing, participating, existing only in that moment, in that small and tranquil space. Can intentional simplicity be more powerful than complexity for calming the mind? But the tea ceremony was just one of the practices. Perhaps even more central to samurai reintegration was Zazen, seated meditation, the fundamental practice of Zen Buddhism. Mountain temples served as refuges for warriors needing to process their experiences. These places weren't luxurious, they were intentionally austere. Meditation halls with polished wooden floors, simple cushions, the zafu, and nothing more. Bare walls except perhaps for a single window, framing a carefully chosen view. A rock garden, bamboo swaying in wind, or simply the sky. Zazen is deceptively simple. You sit in specific posture, legs crossed, spine erect, hands resting in lap, in a position called Hokkai join that forms a circle, eyes half open looking down at a 45-degree angle, focusing on nothing specific, natural breathing without forcing, and then you just sit. You don't try to empty the mind. That's impossible and isn't the goal. Instead, you observe thoughts arising, acknowledge them, and let them pass, like clouds crossing the sky. You are the sky, not the clouds. For a samurai with a mind full of difficult memories, this at first is almost unbearable. Sitting in silence means there's nothing to distract from thoughts you've been avoiding. They come in waves, images, sounds, sensations. The impulse is to get up, do anything to escape. But here's the deep wisdom of Zazen. You don't escape. You stay, you observe. And gradually, taking days, weeks, sometimes months, the thoughts lose their intensity. They don't disappear, but you develop a different relationship with them. You realize that thoughts are just thoughts, memories are just memories. They can't hurt you in the present unless you give them that power. This practice was usually guided by a Zen monk, a Roshi, who had himself made this journey. He didn't offer direct advice or therapy in the modern sense. Instead, he asked baffling questions, the famous Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your original face before your parents were born? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. These questions don't have logical answers. That's exactly the point. They force the mind out of its habitual thought patterns. They force you to confront the nature of reality, identity, existence in ways that common logic cannot reach. And in the process of wrestling with these impossible questions, something happens. Rigid certainties begin to dissolve. The narratives you tell about yourself, I am a warrior, I did terrible things, I'll never be the same, begin to seem less absolute. You begin to see that identity is more fluid than you thought. Curious how questions without answers can sometimes be more useful than ready answers, isn't it? Another crucial aspect of samurai practice was contemplative physical work. Zen monks have an expression: before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. The work continues, life continues, but your relationship with it changes. Samurai in temples spent hours doing simple tasks. Sweeping the garden, not just to clean it, but as meditation, each movement of the broom deliberate and attentive. Watering plants, preparing food, repairing tools, washing clothes in the cold stream. There was something deeply restorative about this return to basics. After months making life or death decisions, complex strategic choices, simply sweeping a stone path was liberating. There was no moral ambiguity in sweeping, no impossible choices. Just a simple task, well done. And in the repetitive rhythm of these activities, the mind found its own rhythm again. Japanese Zen gardens, the famous karisansui or rock gardens, also served as healing tools. They weren't just decorative, they were designed specifically to facilitate contemplation and presence. A typical Zen garden is composed of carefully positioned stones in gravel or white sand. The sand is raked in patterns that suggest water waves. The stones represent islands or mountains or nothing specific, just forms the mind can contemplate without needing to categorize them. Sitting beside one of these gardens, observing how light changes throughout the day, how shadows move, how wind occasionally disturbs patterns in sand. This induces a specific mental state, not exactly deep meditation, but also not active thinking. Something in between. A mental space where healing can happen organically. And then there was the practice of samu, gardening work as meditation. Samurai often spent time caring for these gardens, raking sand in perfect patterns, adjusting stones, removing fallen leaves one by one with total attention. This meticulous work had a psychological function. It created external order when there was internal disorder, and gradually the external order began to reflect internally. There are interesting parallels with what today we call occupational therapy or mindfulness-based practices. But perhaps the most profound practice, and certainly the most challenging, was the concept of mu or emptiness. Not empty in the sense of absence, but empty in the sense of pure potential. Like a cup needs to be empty to be filled with something new. For a samurai carrying the weight of past experiences, learning to cultivate mu meant creating internal space, not repressing memories or emotions, but not clinging to them either, allowing them to flow through you without defining you. There was a famous Zen story about two monks and a woman. They arrived at a river where a woman was stuck, unable to cross. The first monk, without hesitating, carried her on his back across the water and set her down on the other side. The monks then continued walking in silence for hours. Finally, the second monk exploded. "How could you do that? Monks shouldn't touch women." The first monk replied calmly, "I left the woman at the riverbank. Are you still carrying her?" This story was told frequently to samurai struggling with difficult memories. The implicit question, what are you still carrying that you could have left behind long ago? Do we carry unnecessary burdens simply because we forgot we can let them go? Another fascinating aspect of samurai culture was the integration of martial arts and meditation. Kendo, Kyudo, archery, Iaido, art of drawing the sword, all were practiced not just as combat techniques, but as paths to spiritual development. Kyudo is particularly interesting. The art of the Japanese bow is extremely ritualized. There's a specific form for each movement: how to hold the bow, how to position feet, how to pull the string, how to release. And the goal isn't to hit the target, or rather, hitting the target is the natural consequence of executing the form perfectly with clear mind. A Kyudo master would say, "When your mind is calm, the arrow finds its way naturally." For samurai returning from battle, practicing these martial arts in their meditative aspect, not competitive, not violent, offered a way to reconnect with their warrior skills, but in completely different context. You were still skilled with bow, sword, spear. But now these skills served personal development, not destruction. There was a powerful symbolic transformation in this. The same hands that had taken lives now cultivated life. Through gardening, calligraphy, tea ceremony. The same reflexes trained for combat now were applied to practices of peace. Japanese calligraphy, shodo, deserves special mention here. It's not just writing beautiful characters, it's meditation through ink and brush. Each stroke must be executed with total intention, without hesitation. You can't correct, can't go back. What's done is done. And in this there's a profound lesson about acceptance, about making peace with actions that cannot be undone, about finding beauty and meaning in the imperfect. There's even a Japanese aesthetic concept, wabi-sabi, that celebrates imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. A tea bowl with a crack isn't discarded, it's repaired with gold, making the crack part of its history, its beauty. Imagine the psychological impact of this for a samurai feeling broken by his experiences. The message is clear: you're not ruined. You're being repaired with gold. Your cracks are part of who you are now, and can be a source of strength, not weakness. What a transformative vision of trauma and resilience. Women also had crucial roles in this reintegration process, though differently from the cultures we've seen before. In feudal Japan, samurai wives were often trained in naginata, a pole weapon, and in domestic strategy. They weren't passive. When a samurai returned, his wife didn't try to fix him. Instead, she maintained the home as a space of order and tranquility. She maintained daily rituals, meal preparation, house organization, small domestic altars for ancestors. This consistency offered an anchor, and there was a specific practice called kotodama, the spiritual power of words. Certain phrases were repeated not as empty affirmations, but as cultivated intentions. A wife might gently repeat, "Peace dwells in this home. We are together now. The path unfolds as it should." They weren't commands. They were gentle reminders of present reality versus past that's already gone. A story that well illustrates this integration of practices is that of Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps Japan's most famous samurai. He was one of the greatest swordsmen who ever lived, winning more than 60 duels. But after decades as a warrior, he retired to a mountain cave, and there, in the last years of his life, he didn't practice swordsmanship. He painted, wrote poetry, practiced calligraphy, meditated, and wrote the Book of Five Rings, not just a strategy manual, but a profound philosophical guide. In his own words, the ultimate aim of the way of the warrior is not victory in battle, but victory over oneself. This transformation, from warrior focused on external enemies to warrior focused on internal growth, was the heart of the samurai tradition of healing and reintegration. And there was something more, something the Japanese understood deeply: the importance of negative space, interval, pause, not just doing things, but also not doing, not filling every moment. In traditional Japanese music, the silences between notes are considered as important as the notes themselves. In flower arrangements, ikebana, the empty space around flowers is a deliberate part of the composition. Similarly, in healing a warrior, it wasn't just about adding practices. It was also about creating space. Space to do nothing, space to simply be, space where things could resolve naturally without constant intervention. How often do we try to fix things when what we really need is space for them to fix themselves? Zen temples also offered silence retreats, periods that could last weeks when no word was spoken. Communication happened through minimal gestures, and in this deep and prolonged silence, layers of mental noise gradually dissipated. At first, silence is uncomfortable. Your mind screams louder to compensate. But if you remain with it, eventually something changes. The internal volume decreases, and in the silence that emerges, you can finally hear more subtle things. Intuitions, internal wisdoms, the calm voice of your own center. There were also mountain retreats, Sangaku Shugen, where sacred mountains were climbed as spiritual journeys. It wasn't about physical conquest, but about each step being a meditation, each difficulty an opportunity to practice presence and tranquil determination. For a samurai, climbing a sacred mountain after returning from war had special meaning. Each upward step symbolized leaving the past behind. The air became more rarefied, forcing you to slow down, to breathe more consciously. And when you finally reached the top, often where there was a small shrine, the view was transformative. Seeing the world from above, small and interconnected, offered that shift in perspective that so many cultures recognized as essential for healing. Your problems still existed, but were a tiny point in a vast landscape. And then the descent, which in many spiritual traditions is considered more important than the ascent, because ascending is about aspiration, descending is about integration, bringing back to daily life what you learned in the heights. The samurai understood that enlightenment didn't mean staying on the mountaintop. It meant returning to the valley, to ordinary life, but transformed. Still chopping wood and carrying water, but differently. And there's one more Zen practice that was particularly powerful: kinhin, or walking meditation. Between long periods of seated zazen, practitioners made extremely slow walks around the meditation hall. Each step took perhaps 10 seconds. You felt every minute shift of weight, every muscle involved, the texture of floor underfoot. And in this extreme slowness, something extraordinary happened. Time expanded. One circle around the hall could seem to contain an entire lifetime. For someone feeling that time had passed too quickly during traumatic experiences or too slowly during suffering, kinhin offered a way to reset temporal perception, to return to inhabiting the present moment at its natural speed. It's fascinating how such simple practices, sitting, walking, sweeping, can have such profound effects when done with total attention. Only all this Japanese wisdom, though profound, didn't exist in a vacuum. It was influenced by centuries of exchange with China, Korea, India. Zen Buddhism itself originally came from India through China. And if we look at other warrior traditions around the world, Vikings with their sagas, medieval knights with their pilgrimages, African warriors with their dance rituals, we find similar themes but unique expressions. And all these different paths converged on similar truths about human nature, about trauma, about what it really means to be strong. But exploring these other traditions, that needs its own space, its own attention. For now, as the soft light filtered through rice paper begins to change tone, announcing day's end, let this image land, a samurai sitting in absolute silence, a bowl of tea cooling in his hands, finally, after so long, simply breathing, at peace. The theatre of the soul. Ancient Greece had a unique understanding of what it means to be human. They didn't separate body and mind, reason and emotion, individual and community, the way we do today. For them, everything was interconnected, and this was deeply reflected in how they treated warriors returning from campaigns. Unlike the Romans with their individual baths, or the Mongols with their solitary journeys, the Greeks believed that deep healing could only happen in community. Not because you needed to talk about your experiences, although you could, but because you needed to feel part of something larger again. You needed to remember you weren't just a warrior, but a citizen, a friend, a member of the polis. And the most profound way they did this was through festivals. But not festivals as we imagine today, noisy and chaotic celebrations. These were carefully structured events that combined religious ritual, artistic performance, athletic competition, and communal meals in experiences that could last for days. Imagine a hoplite, a Greek infantry soldier, returning from months fighting in the Persian Wars. He saw the phalanx form and break, saw friends fall beside him, carried the weight of the bronze shield for hours on end until his arms screamed. And now he's back in Athens or Sparta or Corinth. The first thing that happens isn't an interrogation about his experiences, it's an invitation. The Dionysian festival begins in 3 days. Will you come? The festival of Dionysus, god of wine, but also of transformation and ecstasy, was one of the most important on the Greek calendar. And it had specific components that served, intentionally or not, as profound reintegration processes. It began with processions, The entire city participated, walking together through the streets toward the theatre. Rich and poor, young and old, veterans and civilians. The pace was slow, almost meditative. Music from flutes filled the air. Not cheerful melodies, but deeper, resonant tones that vibrated in the chest. There was something powerfully equalizing about these processions. Everyone walking at the same rhythm in the same direction, part of a larger human flow. For a soldier who might have felt isolated by his experiences, this immersion in collective movement offered a first step back toward belonging, and then they arrived at the theatre. Not theatres as we know them today. These were massive amphitheatres carved into hillsides. The theatre of Dionysus in Athens could accommodate 17,000 people. Imagine the scale of that. You sit on stone bleachers, still warm from the afternoon sun. Around you, thousands of other Athenians. Below, the orchestra, the circle where the performance would happen. And beyond, the view opens to the city and sea in the distance. Just being there, something began. A sensation of being part of something vast, ancient, important. And then the performances began. But they weren't light entertainment. They were tragedies, profound stories about suffering, impossible moral choice, the consequences of human actions, the intervention of gods. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These playwrights weren't trying to make people laugh. They were exploring the darkest parts of human experience. Why would this be part of a healing festival? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Exposing people who have already seen real suffering to dramatic representations of more suffering. But here's the profound wisdom. The tragedies created safe distance. You weren't watching your own story, but a mythical story about Oedipus or Agamemnon or Medea. And yet, the themes were universal. Guilt, loss, the impossibility of perfect choices, the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions. A soldier sitting in those bleachers could see his own moral dilemmas reflected but externalized. He could feel the emotions. The Greeks had a word for this: catharsis, purification through emotion, without being consumed by them. It was safe to cry there. Everyone around was crying. The tragedy gave collective permission to release what was trapped inside. Aristotle, writing about tragedy, said its purpose was to evoke pity and fear, to purge these emotions, not suppress but purge. Let them flow through you in controlled and communal context. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey, and there's another layer to this. Greek tragedies rarely ended with simple, happy endings. They often ended with ambiguity, with unanswered questions, with recognition that life is complicated and that not all suffering has clear meaning. And this too was therapeutic. For a warrior trying to find meaning in traumatic experiences, the implicit message of the tragedies was comforting. Not everything needs to make sense. Not every story has clean resolution. And this is part of the human condition, not personal failure. After the tragedies came the comedies, and these also had specific function. Ancient Greek comedies were irreverent, subversive, often obscene. They mocked politicians, gods, social conventions. Nothing was sacred, and the laughter they provoked was liberating in a different way from the tears of tragedy. It was a way of saying, we don't take everything so seriously. There's absurdity in life. There's permission to be human, imperfect, ridiculous sometimes. For someone carrying the weight of trying to always be strong, always honorable, always living up to heroic ideals, these comedies offered relief. It was okay to be flawed. It was even funny. But the festivals weren't just about watching. There was also active participation. Athletic competitions were a central part of almost every major Greek festival, the Olympics being the most famous, but there were many others. And these competitions had profound meaning for veterans. They were a way to reconnect with their bodies in non-violent ways, running, wrestling, throwing discus or javelin. These were athletic skills, not killing techniques. You were still strong, fast, competent. But now these qualities served different purposes, and competition happened under strict rules, with judges, with fair play expected. It was the opposite of battle's chaos. It was order, structure, mutual agreement about how physical engagement could happen without destruction. Winning brought honor, but not the blood-stained honor of the battlefield. It was clean honor, celebrated by all, without death as cost, and losing also had its dignity. You competed well, gave your best, and that was respected. Don't we underestimate the value of structured and safe physical competition for processing aggressive impulses? Another crucial aspect of festivals was communal meals, the symposia. But they weren't just banquets. They were highly structured events with their own rules and purposes. A typical symposium happened after sunset. Men gathered, usually between 10 and 30, in a special room. They reclined on couches arranged in a circle, or U, allowing everyone to see each other. Lighting was soft, from oil lamps that created intimate atmosphere. Wine was served, but always mixed with water. Greeks considered drinking pure wine barbaric. The proportion was decided collectively, usually 3 parts water to 1 wine, enough to loosen tongues but not to lose control. And then conversations began, but not casual conversations. There was a symposiarch, a master of ceremonies, who proposed discussion topics. Often they were philosophical questions. What is courage? What do we owe the dead? How do we live well knowing we will die? These weren't abstract questions for veterans. They were deeply personal. And in the safe environment of the symposium, with wine softening defenses, with friends around, with the structure of philosophical discussion allowing intellectual distance from raw emotions, men could explore these questions together. No one was forced to share specific battle experiences, but through philosophical discussion, values could be examined, perspectives could be compared, collective wisdom could emerge. And often symposia included poetry. Not just reciting others' poetry, but creating improvised poetry. There were games where someone started a verse and the next had to continue, or competitions for who could create the cleverest epigram on a given theme. This collective creativity, this playing with language and meaning, engaged different parts of the brain from those used in combat or trauma processing. It was restorative in subtle but real ways. The Greeks also had specific purification rituals that happened before major festivals. The most famous was at Eleusis, where the Eleusinian mysteries occurred annually. These mysteries were secret. Participants took vows never to reveal what happened there. And surprisingly, this vow was respected so well that to this day we don't know exactly what happened in the central ceremonies, but we know enough to understand the structure and purpose. The path to Eleusis was itself a ritual. 20 kilometers from Athens, walked over 2 days. The journey was intentional, slow, with stops at specific shrines along the way. You didn't go alone. You went with hundreds or thousands of other initiates and mystery veterans. Upon arriving, there were ritual purifications in the sea. Diving into salt water, letting waves wash over you. The salt on skin, the rhythmic sound of waves, the sensation of being small before the vast ocean. All this prepared for what would come. And then, on the specific night, all initiates entered the telesterion, the great initiation hall. It could accommodate thousands. The doors closed, torches were extinguished. Total darkness. What happened in that darkness is subject to speculation. There was probably ritual performance, perhaps consumption of sacred drink that altered perception, certainly experiences designed to induce altered states of consciousness. And at the ritual's climax, something was revealed, a sudden light, a sacred object, a vision. Participants emerged transformed. Historical accounts speak of people who no longer feared death after Eleusis, who had gained perspective on life and suffering, who felt connected to something eternal. For veterans carrying the weight of mortality, their own that they almost lost, and others that they saw lose, this experience of confronting death in ritual context and emerging with new perspective could be profoundly liberating. Interesting how mystery and not knowing can also be healing tools, not just rational understanding. The Greeks also developed philosophy as a path of healing. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle weren't just abstract thinkers. They were deeply interested in how to live well, how to process suffering, how to find meaning. The Socratic practice of questioning itself, the meutics, can be seen as a form of therapy. Socrates didn't give answers. He asked questions that forced you to examine your own beliefs, confront contradictions, recognize what you truly knew versus what you assumed. For a warrior returning with shaken certainties about justice, about courage, about what is right, this process of guided philosophical deconstruction could be the beginning of rebuilding a more solid foundation. And the philosophical schools that emerged, particularly the Stoics and Epicureans, offered complete frameworks for living with equanimity in the face of suffering. The Stoics taught that we can't control external events, only our responses to them. That virtue resides not in avoiding suffering, but in maintaining character in the face of it. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor Roman, was deeply influenced by Greek Stoicism, and his meditations are essentially a diary of someone applying Stoic philosophy to process the difficulties of governing and warring. The Epicureans, on the other hand, taught that life's goal is ataraxia, tranquility of spirit, not through extreme pleasures but through simple life, deep friendships and liberation from unnecessary fears, particularly fear of death and gods. Both philosophies offered paths through suffering that recognized its reality but refused to let it have the last word on how to live. There was also the tradition of gymnasium, not just places of physical exercise, but complete centers of physical, intellectual, and social development. A typical gymnasium included running tracks, wrestling areas, bathing rooms, influence that Romans would later expand, and, crucially, spaces for philosophical lectures and discussions. A veteran could spend the entire day there. Begin with intense physical exercise, running, wrestling, weightlifting. Physical exhaustion has its own therapeutic benefit. Then, baths to relax. And then, still wrapped in toga, sit under the stoa, you'd send the covered porticos, and listen to a philosopher discourse or participate in debate about ethics and meaning. It was holistic integration, body, mind, community, all being nourished simultaneously. And the Greeks understood the importance of beauty in the healing process. Their cities were full of art, sculptures, wall paintings, temples with mathematically perfect proportions designed to evoke harmony. It wasn't superficial decoration, it was therapeutic. Beauty reminds you there's order in the universe, that there are things that transcend human conflict, that are worth preserving and protecting. A veteran walking through the Parthenon, observing the perfect columns, the elaborate friezes telling mythological stories, the statue of Athena in gold and ivory, was being reminded of what he had fought to protect. Not just land or wealth, but civilization, art, beauty, humanity's capacity to create things that elevate the spirit. Do we neglect beauty as a healing component in our own approaches? But perhaps the most profound Greek practice was the concept of xenia, sacred hospitality. It wasn't just being polite to visitors, it was a fundamental religious value. Zeus was the protector of strangers and suppliants. Violating Xenia was offending the gods, and this had direct implications for veterans. If you were traveling, if you were displaced, if you were searching for place, any Greek had sacred obligation to receive you, feed you, shelter you, without asking questions. This system created an informal but powerful social safety net. A veteran who couldn't reintegrate in his hometown could travel, be received in other communities, have time and space to find his way. And more than that, Xenia recognized something profound, that sometimes we are strangers even to ourselves, that we need to be received back with hospitality and without judgment until we feel at home again within our own skin. A story that well illustrates these practices is that of Xenophon. He was soldier, adventurer, historian, and philosopher. He participated in the expedition of the 10,000 Greek mercenaries who fought in Persia. When the army was betrayed and leaders killed, Xenophon emerged as one of the improvised leaders who guided survivors in epic retreat back to Greece. Afterward, he wrote about these experiences not just as military account but as philosophical reflection. He studied with Socrates, participated in symposia, retired to rural property where he raised horses and wrote treatises on everything from household economy to leadership. His life demonstrates the Greek integration of action and reflection, of physical experience and intellectual processing. He didn't deny his war experiences, but also didn't let them define him completely. He was warrior and thinker and citizen, and all these identities coexisted. And the Greeks had one last fascinating element, the culture of intergenerational mentorship. Older men who had gone through war and found peace on the other side had implicit responsibility to guide younger ones, not through lectures or unsolicited advice, but through presence. Sitting in the gymnasium and being available for conversation, participating in symposia and sharing wisdom when appropriate, modeling how it was possible to live well even carrying difficult memories. This transmission of lived wisdom was precious information that no text or ritual could completely replace. It was the living message. I've been where you are. I found a path. You can too. Funny how so many ancient cultures recognize the value of veterans not just as warriors, but as potential wise men. And as the sun sets over the theatre of Dionysus, casting long shadows through the now empty bleachers, as the echo of the tragedy's last line still resonates in the ancient stones, there's something to carry with us. The Greeks understood that healing isn't a private process, it's a communal process. It happens between people through shared art, collective ritual, deep conversation, friendly competition, beauty that all can see. You don't heal alone. You heal by being received back, by being included, by being reminded that you belong. Only all this Greek wisdom, however profound, was specific to a type of society and war. And when we look at other contexts, Nordic fjords, African deserts, American jungles, we find fascinating adaptations of these same principles, but expressed in unique ways. And these cultural variations reveal something even deeper about what it means to be human and how we process difficult experiences. But exploring these other traditions will need its own time, its own space to breathe and be fully understood. Sagas of the North. In the northern fjords, where snow-covered mountains plunge into waters dark as mirrors, the Vikings developed a unique way of processing difficult experiences. They transformed them into stories, not private stories whispered in confession, but elaborate poetic sagas told and retold until brutal events became part of a larger narrative fabric that transcended individual suffering. Imagine a Norse warrior returning from months at sea. He sailed to distant lands, perhaps the British Isles, perhaps farther, to the Mediterranean. He saw storms that broke ships like twigs, participated in lightning raids, lost companions to the icy sea, to enemy blades, to diseases that decimated entire crews. He returns to his village, a cluster of wooden and turf houses nestled between fjord and mountains. Smoke rises from chimneys. The smell of smoked fish and burning wood fills the cold air. And when he disembarks, when his feet touch firm ground again, he's not immediately questioned about his experiences. First, there's a meal. The community gathers in the langhus, the longhouse. It's an impressive structure, built with massive wooden beams, the high ceiling supported by elaborately carved columns. The central fire crackles, sending smoke upward toward the hole in the roof. The light is golden, dancing, creating shadows that move on the walls. Beer is served in horns. Mutton is slowly roasted over coals. There's barley bread still warm. And while everyone eats, there's conversation. But not about the journey, about harvests, about marriages and births that happened while men were away, about the neighbor's new horse, about normal, everyday things comforting in their banality. This intentional normalcy is the first step, reminding the warrior that life exists beyond blade and sail, that the world kept turning while he was absent, that there's a place for him in this world. Do we underestimate the value of simply sharing meals without expectations of immediate emotional processing? But then, after food has been eaten and horns filled again, something shifts. Someone, usually an elder, someone respected, stands and raises his horn, makes a toast, not to gods, not to victory, but to companions who sailed and returned, and then invites. Who will tell the saga of this journey? Here's the fundamental difference of the Viking approach. They didn't ask for factual reports, didn't want military chronologies. They wanted saga, story elevated to art, event transformed into epic, raw experience refined through poetic language until it became something that could be carried more lightly. Often it wasn't the warrior himself who told first. It was the skald, the official poet, the keeper of stories. The skald had specific skill, taking events and molding them into narrative form that honored experience but also created distance through art. He might begin like this, his voice adopting the specific rhythm of ancient Norse poetry. Hear now of men who sailed over whale roads, under raven wings, where Ran, Lady of Depths, awaits, and only the brave see land again. The rhythm of Norse poetry, with its strong alliterations, its elaborate kennings, compound metaphors, created hypnotic pattern. Whale road for ocean, raven wings for sails, Lady of Depths for the sea goddess. This poetic language did something crucial, created a layer of beauty over brutality. And while the skald told, warriors who had been there could interrupt, add details, correct, but always within the poetic framework. You didn't say John died. You said John found Odin in the Golden Hall, or the sea claimed its blood debt. This linguistic formalization wasn't denial, it was transformation. It took what had been chaotic and traumatic and organized it into narrative with structure, with meaning, with place in the great fabric of stories the culture told about itself. Curious how narrative structure can be a tool for emotional processing, not just entertainment. And there's more. Viking sagas almost always included greater contextualization. The journey's story didn't begin with "we left in March." It began with genealogy, who these men's ancestors were, what sagas they had participated in, how this current journey connected to older traditions. A warrior could hear his experience being woven into the tapestry of generations. His grandfather had sailed these same waters. His great-grandfather had faced similar storms. He wasn't alone in his experience. He was continuing something, being part of a tradition that preceded him and would continue after him. This generational perspective had profound psychological effect. His suffering wasn't unique, wasn't a sign of personal weakness. It was part of what it meant to be a Norse man, sailor, explorer. It was almost expected, and others had gone through it and found their way. The sagas also did something fascinating with violence and death. They didn't glorify them simplistically, but also didn't portray them as absurd or meaningless. Instead, death in saga was always contextualized by concepts like hamingja, luck, fate, drengskappa, honor, courage, and the notion that how you died defined your legacy more than how long you lived. A companion who died saving others wasn't just killed in combat. His saga told how he saw the wave coming, how he pushed 3 men to safety before being taken, how he shouted words of encouragement even as the sea swallowed him. And now he was in Valhalla, in Odin's hall, waiting for companions who would eventually join him. This narrative offered a structure of meaning. Death wasn't random end, it was transition to another state, and the way it happened mattered. This didn't eliminate grief, but framed it within a cosmology that made sense for that culture. Does the absence of shared meaning structures make it harder to process loss in modern societies? But sagas weren't just told once, they were told repeatedly. In the long nights of the Nordic winter, when the sun barely rose and darkness dominated for up to 20 hours a day, communities gathered in the longhouse night after night, and the sagas were told again, but never exactly the same way. Each teller added their own style, emphasized different aspects, elaborated certain details, and warriors who had been there heard their own experiences being reinterpreted, recontextualized, refined through multiple retellings. Over time, something extraordinary happened. Raw, traumatic memory began to be replaced by the saga version. It wasn't forgetting, it was transformation. The event was still there, but now it had form, beauty, meaning. It wasn't just something that happened to you, but something that happened through you, and that now belonged to the entire community as shared story. Modern psychologists call this narrative rewriting, a therapeutic technique where trauma is reprocessed through retelling in different ways. The Vikings were doing this 1,000 years ago, but collectively, as cultural practice. And there's another fascinating aspect. Viking women had crucial roles in this saga-making process. They weren't just passive listeners, many were skalds themselves, poets and story keepers. And often it was they who preserved the sagas, teaching them to children, ensuring they were passed forward. There was something deeply honorable about that. Your story would be kept by the community's women, taught to your children, becoming part of collective identity. You became an ancestor, even while still alive. Women also had their own sagas and about maintaining homes while men were away, about surviving raiders, about making difficult decisions in the absence of husbands and brothers. And these sagas were told with the same respect, the same artistic care. This created reciprocity. Men honored women's experiences through saga. Women honored men's experiences. No one was just a listener. Everyone was tellers and listeners alternately. But beyond spoken sagas, there was another profound Viking practice, rune stones. When someone died, especially someone important, a large stone was raised, carved with runes telling their story. These stones were placed in public places, along roads, near markets, in clearings where communities gathered. And passing by, people read the runes. The person's saga was literally inscribed in the landscape, permanent, public, impossible to ignore. For surviving warriors who had lost companions, these stones offered something tangible. Memory wasn't just in their heads, subject to fading or distortion. It was in rock, would be read by generations. The lost companion wouldn't be forgotten, and the process of creating these stones, choosing the rock, carving the runes, raising the monument, was itself a grief ritual. Physical work, careful craftsmanship, communal effort to honor the dead. There's something therapeutic about creating physical memorials, about transforming grief into constructive action. The Vikings also had a unique relationship with nature that facilitated processing. The fjords, these narrow corridors of water surrounded by vertical cliffs, created an environment of profound quietness. When a warrior needed space, he could take a small boat and row into the fjord. The sound of oars cutting water, the soft echo against rocky walls, the vertical vastness of mountains around, all this induced a contemplative state. Fjord water is incredibly calm, protected from ocean winds by mountains. Often it's so smooth it perfectly mirrors sky and mountains, creating disconcerting symmetry. You're rowing through reflections, unable to distinguish where reality ends and mirror begins. There's something symbolically powerful about this. Reality and reflection, event and memory. Impossible to separate completely, but both coexisting. And in winter, when snow covered everything, the fjords had a quality of almost supernatural silence. Snow absorbs sound. The world becomes muffled, distant. In this profound quietness, thoughts could finally quiet too. The Norse had specific practices for winter, veturnatur, winter nights. They were times of introspection, manual work, storytelling, processing what had happened during sailing season. Men carved wood, not randomly but creating things, tool handles, boat decorations, toys for children. The rhythm of carving, the focus needed not to cut wrong, the satisfaction of seeing form emerge from raw wood. All this had meditative quality. Women wove, and Viking weaving was complex art, creating elaborate patterns that told stories themselves. Often, sagas were literally woven into tapestries, visual representations of narratives that could be hung on longhouse walls. Seeing your saga represented visually had different impact from just hearing it. It was another form of transformation, like from lived experience to spoken narrative to visual representation. Each layer added distance, but also preservation. Curious how multiple art forms, oral, visual, written, all served the same purpose of processing and preserving experience. The Vikings also had the concept of hamingja, something between luck, destiny, and strength of character. It wasn't fixed. It could increase or decrease based on actions and attitudes. And crucially, it could be borrowed or shared within families and groups. When a warrior had low hamingja, what today we call depression or trauma, the community could lend their hamingja. Through presence, support, inclusion in activities, telling stories of their own successes and resilience. It wasn't something mystical without substance. It was practical recognition that sometimes we need others' strength when ours fails.
And that this isn't weakness, it's part of being in community. There were also specific festivals at the Blot where animals were sacrificed and massive communal meals happened. These weren't just religious, they were opportunities for dispersed communities to gather, for stories to be shared, for bonds to be reinforced. During Blot, warriors were expected to tell something of their journeys, but not necessarily the difficult parts.
They could tell about strange places they saw, curious people they met, natural wonders they encountered. This allowed sharing without re-traumatizing. You could talk about the journey without talking about violence, and it was equally valued. After all, Vikings were explorers as much as warriors, and there's that fascinating practice of holmgang, ritual duel. But it wasn't necessarily violent. It could be competition of any type, poetry, strength, about skill with tools. The point was resolving conflicts or proving worth through structured confrontation. For veterans sometimes feeling residual aggression, having structured outlets where competition could happen with clear rules and without lethal consequences was crucial. You could test yourself, prove you were still capable, but in safe context. A story that well illustrates Viking wisdom is that of Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most famous poet-warriors. He was a fierce raider, killed many men, lived an extremely violent life. But he was also an extraordinary poet. His sagas and poems survive to this day. When his son drowned, Egil was so devastated he locked himself in his room, refusing food, planning to let himself die. His daughter, worried, asked that he at least compose a grief poem for his son before dying, and Egil began to compose. And in the process of finding words, of molding his pain into poetic form, something changed. The poem, called Sonatorek, Loss of Sons, is one of the most emotionally raw works of ancient Norse literature. And upon finishing it, Egil decided to live. Art, structure, the act of transforming ineffable pain into language, this gave him reason to continue. Don't we give sufficient value to artistic creativity as a tool for processing grief and trauma? The Vikings also had the practice of fyrirgefa, forgiveness, but not in the Christian sense. It was more about releasing the weight, recognizing that carrying vengeance or anger indefinitely harmed you more than the other. Sagas often included moments where old warriors told how they decided to let certain things go. Not from weakness, but from wisdom. Because carrying everything wears you down until nothing remains. And then, on the longest winter nights, when the fire burned low and most had gone to sleep, sometimes an old veteran took a young warrior aside and didn't tell epic saga, told quiet truths, how the first man he killed still visited him in dreams, how he learned to live with it, not forgetting, not justifying, but integrating, how he found meaning in building, in planting, in teaching children to carve miniature boats. These whispered conversations didn't become public sagas. They were personal transmissions of lived wisdom, and they were precious precisely because they were private, intimate, honest, in ways public sagas couldn't be. So the Vikings had both. The public saga that elevated and transformed, and the private conversation that acknowledged raw truth. And both were necessary. Both were part of the path back to peace. And as the aurora borealis dances in the Arctic sky, green and purple curtains undulating in hypnotic patterns through darkness, an old warrior sits outside, wrapped in furs, watching the spectacle. He's seen many winters, survived many journeys, and found, finally, something resembling peace, not because he forgot, but because he transformed memories into stories, and stories into wisdom, and wisdom into something he can now offer to younger ones beginning their own journeys. Only all this Norse wisdom, however beautiful in the frozen lands of the north, is just one expression of something universal. And when we turn our gaze south to the sun-drenched lands of the medieval Mediterranean, we find another warrior culture with its own profound practices of transformation. But these practices had different flavor, influenced by different faith, different landscape, different challenges, and exploring how medieval knights sought redemption through pilgrimage and faith that deserves its own careful contemplation. Paths of redemption. In medieval Europe, where stone castles dotted green hills and dense forests hid dangers and marvels, knights developed a complex relationship with violence and faith. They were warriors trained from youth, but they were also Christians living under the weight of commandments that said, "Thou shalt not kill." This tension between martial duty and spiritual conscience created unique practices of reconciliation and healing. Imagine a knight returning from the Crusades. He spent years in the Holy Land, fighting under scorching sun in strange land. He saw Jerusalem, the holy city, but also saw what happens when faith mixes with sword. He did things in God's name that now haunt his knights. And when he finally returns, crossing the Mediterranean, then months of overland travel, he arrives at his lord's castle, or the small village where he was born, and he finds a world that doesn't quite know what to do with him. There's gratitude, there's honor, there's celebration of his return. But there's also distance. People sense he brought something back with him, not just stories or treasures, but an invisible weight that changes how he moves through the world. And often, not long after returning, he makes a decision. He will go on pilgrimage. Medieval pilgrimage wasn't vacation. It wasn't tourism. It was intentional spiritual journey, often arduous, done on foot toward a sacred place where it was believed divine presence was especially accessible. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome with the apostles' tombs, Jerusalem if you had courage and resources for such a long journey. But the destination, though important, wasn't really the point. The journey itself was what transformed. Think about it this way. You leave behind your armor, too heavy to carry hundreds of miles. You leave your sword. Pilgrims don't carry weapons. You wear simple clothes. You take a wooden staff to help with walking. You put on a wide-brimmed hat to protect from sun. And you attach a shell to your cloak, the pilgrim symbol, recognizable to all. And then you start walking. The first days are the hardest. Your body, accustomed to riding or short bursts of intense activity in combat, complains about the demand of walking hour after hour, day after day. Blisters form on feet. Muscles you didn't even know you had ache. Each step is conscious effort. But something happens after a few days. The body adapts. Muscles find their rhythm. And more importantly, the mind begins to calm. When you're walking, there's not much else you can do besides put one foot in front of the other. Complex problems seem simpler. Constant worries begin to diminish. Does repetitive and prolonged movement have therapeutic effects that we underestimate? Pilgrimage paths were well established, routes that had been walked by thousands before you, trails worn into earth and stone by generations of feet. And along these paths there was an entire infrastructure dedicated to supporting pilgrims. Monasteries offered hospitality. It didn't matter who you were, rich or poor, noble or peasant, knight or merchant. The rule was clear. Pilgrims should be received as if they were Christ himself. Fed, sheltered, cared for, if sick. This hospitality wasn't passive charity. It was active theology. By serving the pilgrim, the monk was serving God, and by being served, the pilgrim was reminded that he was loved, that he was worthy of care, not for his actions or position, but simply for being human. For a knight carrying the weight of violent acts, this unconditional love offered night after night by strangers who knew nothing of his history could be profoundly healing. And monasteries didn't just offer bed and food, they offered silence, deliberately quiet spaces where the only thing you heard was Gregorian chant whispering through stone corridors, or wind in cloister trees, or the distant sound of a bell marking hours. Silence that wasn't empty, but full. Silence that invited reflection without forcing it. Knights often spent extra days in monasteries, participating in monastic routine. Waking before dawn for matins. The first prayer of the day, sung while the world was still dark. There's something about waking when everything is quiet, when you're one of few, conscious in a sleeping world, that creates a particular sensation of peace. And then, throughout the day, the rhythm of canonical hours, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. The entire structure of the day organized around moments of stopping, of singing, of prayer. It wasn't about the specific words necessarily, but about the rhythm, the regular pause, the constant reminder that there was something greater than your individual concerns. The monks also worked, and pilgrims often joined them.
Manual work. Digging in the garden, copying manuscripts, repairing roofs, making bread. Silent work, shared. Where you were side by side with other people, but didn't need to talk. Where the work itself was the communication. There's something deeply restorative about simple physical work done in communal silence. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. And then, after days or weeks in a monastery, the pilgrim moved on, back to the road.
Back to the rhythm of walking, and now perhaps he began to talk with other pilgrims walking in the same direction. This was a crucial part of the experience. You met people from everywhere, different kingdoms, different languages, different stories. A merchant from Flanders walking beside a knight from Aquitaine, beside a widow from Castile, beside a student from Bologna. And in the evenings, when they stopped in some village or monastery hospitality, stories were shared, but not necessarily direct personal stories. Often they were stories of saints, miracles, legends associated with places they passed through. These stories served similar function to Viking sagas. They created narrative framework where difficult experiences could be contextualized. A knight could hear about St. George slaying the dragon and see in it a metaphor for his own internal conflict. He could hear about St. Francis renouncing violence and find a model of possible transformation. The stories offered maps, not geographic, but spiritual and psychological. They showed that others had made journeys from darkness to light, from violence to peace. And if they could, maybe you could too. Another fascinating aspect of pilgrimages was the temporary equality they created. On the road, titles mattered less. A duke with blisters on his feet suffered as much as a peasant. A countess with hunger appreciated simple bread as much as anyone. This experience of essential equality, all just humans dealing with same basic needs, same physical difficulties, same spiritual search, could be revelatory for knights accustomed to rigid hierarchies. You weren't Sir William of such place. You were just another pilgrim on the path, and there was liberation in that. Pilgrimages also included deliberate penitential practices. Some knights chose to walk barefoot for certain distances, or fast on specific days, or carry stones that they later left at shrines along the way. Physical representations of burdens being released. These practices weren't about punishment. They were about physical embodiment of spiritual processes. The weight of the stone you carry becomes symbol of guilt's weight. And when you leave it on an altar, saying a prayer, and continue on without it, your body feels the difference. You're literally lighter. And this physical lightness translates almost magically into sensation of emotional lightness too. Do physical rituals of releasing symbolic burdens have real power, or is it all psychological? And if it's psychological, does that make them less effective? When they finally arrived at the destination, let's say Santiago de Compostela, there were specific ceremonies. You entered the cathedral, usually on your knees for the last meters. You touched the central pillar, worn down by millions of hands before yours. You saw the reliquary supposedly containing the remains of the Apostle James, and there was a moment, described in countless pilgrim accounts, of something shifting. Not necessarily a dramatic revelation, more often a quietness descending, a sensation of "it is done." of having arrived not just geographically but internally at some kind of resolution. Pilgrims then often remained in the city for days or weeks. They participated in daily masses, confessed their sins to priests who had heard countless similar confessions, received absolution, not just theological declaration, but profound psychological experience of being told, "You are forgiven, that you can begin again." And eventually they began the journey back. And interestingly, the return was often described as lighter than the outbound, not just because you knew the way, but because something had been left behind. Not forgotten, and you didn't forget what you had done, but integrated, processed, placed in its appropriate place in the larger narrative of your life. There were also military religious orders unique to the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights. These were attempts to synthesize warrior identity with religious life. They weren't monks who occasionally fought, nor were they warriors who occasionally prayed. They were both, completely. And for knights struggling with contradiction between faith and violence, these orders offered structure where both could coexist. You lived under monastic rules and poverty, chastity, obedience. You participated in daily prayers, but you also trained with weapons and fought when necessary, but always within framework that tried to make violence just, controlled, in service of greater purpose. It wasn't a perfect solution. History shows these orders had their own flaws and contradictions, but they offered sincere attempt to integrate aspects of human experience that seemed irreconcilable, and they had specific processing practices. Knights returning from particularly difficult battles were often assigned to non-combat functions for periods, administering order properties, caring for sick in hospitals, teaching novices. It was recognition that you needed time away from direct violence to process and recover. The castles and fortresses of these orders often included beautiful chapels, not great cathedrals but smaller, intimate spaces with acoustics designed for singing. And the Gregorian chant that resonated there had hypnotic quality, male voices in modal harmonies that seemed to reach something ancient and eternal. A knight could sit in these chapels after battle, letting the chant wash over him and find a kind of peace that words couldn't offer. Interesting how different cultures arrived at the conclusion that sound, whether Mongol throat singing, Greek ritual music, or medieval Gregorian, was a healing tool. There was also the practice of regular confession. Different from casual confession, there was general confession, a complete life review, often done before pilgrimages or at moments of significant transition. A knight would sit with a priest for hours, sometimes days, recounting not just specific acts, but thought patterns, motivations, fears. And the priest didn't just listen. He asked questions, offered perspective, helped the knight understand his own actions within a larger moral and psychological framework. It was something between religious confession and modern therapy. And the absolution at the end wasn't just, "you are forgiven," but often included constructive penances, not punishments, but specific actions designed to repair harm or cultivate virtues, opposite to confessed vices. If you had been excessively aggressive, your penance might be serving in a hospital, gently caring for the sick. If you had been greedy, it might be distributing alms. If you had been proud, it might be performing humble tasks in silence. These penances recognize that healing isn't just internal, but also external, expressed through actions in the world. And there's that fascinating tradition of knight-errant, knights who, after particularly difficult experiences, renounced lands and position and simply traveled, offering their services where needed, defending the weak, correcting injustices when they found them. It wasn't escape. It was transformation of identity from warrior in service of specific lord to warrior in service of abstract principles of justice and compassion. And in the process of helping others, they found their own healing. There's something profound about this. The idea that healing yourself often comes through serving others. A story that well illustrates this is that of Inigo Lopez, later known as Saint Ignatius of Loyola. He was a soldier wounded in battle, spent months recovering. During recovery, he read lives of saints for lack of anything else to read, and was transformed, not immediately. It took years. He went on pilgrimage, spent time in monastery, studied theology, struggled with doubts and calling, but eventually founded the Jesuits, an order that combined military discipline with spiritual mission. His life demonstrates that transformation from warrior to something else isn't instantaneous. It's a process, often long, always challenging, but it's possible. The medievals also had understanding that different people needed different paths. Some found peace in silent monasteries, others in long pilgrimages, others in continued but redirected active service. There was no single formula. And there was wisdom in recognizing this, that healing is an individual process, even when it happens in communal context. And as the sun sets over a pilgrimage path, casting long shadows through golden wheat fields, as the distant bell of a village calls for vespers, a tired knight, now pilgrim, sits beside the road. He takes off his boots, massages sore feet, and realizes with something like surprise that he's smiled more today than in months. Not because he forgot what he lived through, but because he began to carry it differently. Like a well-adjusted backpack instead of unbalanced weight that throws you off. It's still there, but better distributed, more manageable, and tomorrow he'll continue walking. Because the journey isn't over yet, maybe it never completely ends, but that's okay. The walking itself has become the healing. Only all these medieval European practices, however elaborate, were just one cultural manifestation of something universal. And if we look beyond Europe, to entire continents with their own rich and complex warrior traditions, we find practices that are simultaneously completely different and profoundly similar. And exploring how warriors in Africa, in the Americas, in Asia, developed their own unique paths back to peace. That's a richness that deserves to be discovered carefully, respectfully, with attention to details that make each tradition special. Rhythms of the earth. In Africa, a vast continent with thousands of cultures, each with its own traditions, warriors have always been an integral part of communities. But unlike some societies where war was a separate profession, in most African cultures, warriors were first community members, and warriors only when necessary. And when they returned from conflict, there were elaborate practices to bring them back not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. Imagine an Ashanti warrior returning from campaign. He defended his kingdom, fought with courage, saw companions fall. And when he approaches his village, seeing the first smoke rising from round huts, hearing distant sounds of daily life, he doesn't simply enter. First he stops at a specific place outside the village, a sacred clearing where an ancient tree spreads its branches, where stones are arranged in a circle. And there he waits, because the community needs to know he's returned, needs to prepare to receive him appropriately. Messengers run to the village. And then something extraordinary begins. The drums start playing. They're not just drums announcing arrival, they're specific rhythms, patterns that carry meaning, that tell story, that prepare both warrior and community for what comes next. The sound travels through the landscape, echoing between hills, vibrating in humid air. And the warrior, sitting in the clearing, hears the drums and feels something in his chest begin to respond. His heart finds the rhythm. His breathing synchronizes. Even before any word is spoken, reconnection has already begun. Through pulse, through rhythm, he's known since childhood. Does rhythm have healing power that goes beyond rational understanding? Elders arrive first. They don't run, they walk with dignity, taking time. They bring fresh water in decorated gourds, simple food, and they sit with the warrior in silence at first. Just presence. Just recognition that he's returned, that he's been seen. After appropriate time, which can be hours, they begin to ask questions, but not what happened or how many did you kill. The questions are different. How is your spirit? Did you bring ghosts with you? Are you ready to leave the warrior in the forest and bring the man back home? These questions recognize something profound. That war changes you, that you may have acquired spiritual weight that needs to be treated before returning to normal life. It's not shameful to admit this. It's expected. It's a natural part of the process. And if the warrior responds, yes, there are ghosts, there is weight, the elders nod. They know. They too were warriors once. And now they initiate the ritual of purification and reintegration. The first step often involves smoke. Specific herbs are burned. African sage leaves, aromatic resins, roots with specific properties. The smoke is thick, perfumed, almost palpable. And the warrior stands while elders use branches to bathe him in smoke, covering every part of his body. The smoke rises in lazy spirals, carrying, it's believed, what needs to be released. The smell is strong but not unpleasant. Earth, resin, something ancient. And while you're wrapped in that blue-white cloud, there's a sensation of layers being removed, of being prepared for transformation. Then comes water. Not just washing, but ritual bathing in river or sacred spring. The water must be running, not standing, because it needs to carry things away, not just clean. And often the warrior submerges completely 3 times while elders sing and clap on the bank. The water is cold, shocking, but each immersion is rebirth. You emerge each time feeling a little lighter, a little cleaner, not just physically, but in some more fundamental way. And there's something about being immersed in natural element, running water that came from distant mountains, that already cleaned thousands before you, that will continue flowing long after, that offers perspective. Your experiences are part of a much larger flow. Water doesn't judge. It just cleans and continues its way. After bathing comes anointing. Oils and butters are applied to skin. Shea butter, seed oils, mixtures passed down through generations. The elders' hands work oils into the warrior's skin with firm but gentle movements. And as they do, they whisper. Not loud enough to hear words, but you feel the intention. Their blessings. Their protective incantations. They're reminders of who you are beyond warrior, son, brother, community member, guardian of traditions. Touch has its own power. Human hands on your skin, in non-sexual, non-violent context, purely careful. This communicates safety in ways words cannot. Your body, which was tool of violence, is now being treated with tenderness. And this recalibrates something deep in you. Curious how intentional and respectful touch can be a form of healing rarely discussed. But the most dramatic, and perhaps most powerful, part of African reintegration rituals is dance. Not dance as entertainment, but dance as transformation, as exorcism, as celebration, as lament. All at once, when the warrior is finally brought back to the village after preliminary rituals, the entire community is gathered. And in the center, a circle has been prepared. Bonfires have been lit around. Drums of different sizes are positioned. And dancers, wearing elaborate masks, special clothes, are ready. The drums begin. Not soft, but strong, immediate. Several drums playing interlaced patterns that create complex polyrhythm. Your body can't stay still when these rhythms start. Something primitive in you responds, wants to move. And then the dancers enter the circle. And they're not just dancing. They're embodying spirits, telling stories, representing forces. a dancer with leopard mask, representing courage and ferocity. Another with hyena mask, representing death and fear. Yet another representing ancestors, guardians, and the warrior is invited, not forced, but clearly expected, to enter the circle. At first, he may hesitate. But the drums don't stop. They pulse, insist, invite. And eventually, he begins to move, maybe just swaying, then stepping to rhythm, and then, gradually, more. The dance intensifies. The warrior may begin to dance his experience, movements that echo combat, but stylized, transformed into art. Thrusts become dance steps, blocks become expressive gestures. He's retelling without words, processing through the body. And around him, the community responds. They clap, sing, shout encouragement. Other dancers interact, sometimes challenging, sometimes supporting, always keeping the warrior in dynamic dialogue. Hours can pass like this. The moon rises, bonfires burn lower and are revived, sweat pours, muscles burn, but you continue because something is happening that's greater than physical fatigue. Something is being worked through movement, through rhythm, through total bodily expression. And then, at some point, and who determines? It is mystery, perhaps elders, perhaps the warrior himself. The rhythm changes. Drums diminish to something slower, softer. Frenetic dance transforms into something more fluid, more serene. This signals transition. The intense part of the process is over. Now comes integration. The warrior is taken to the center, where he sits, and one by one, community members approach. Some touch his shoulder, others offer water. Others simply look in his eyes and nod. Silent recognition of journey shared on spiritual level. No words needed. Dance said everything. Community witnessed. And now the warrior is being received back, not as stranger, but as integral part of the whole again. Do we neglect the power of communal rituals of witnessing and recognition in our modern societies? Different African cultures had fascinating variations of these rituals. The Maasai of East Africa, for example, had elaborate rites of passage for warriors, Marani, making transition to elders. It involved days of ritual, ceremonial cattle slaughter, specific songs, and finally, shaving the head, symbolizing leaving behind warrior identity. The Zulu had rituals where warriors returning from battle had to undergo purification ceremonies conducted by healers, Sangoma. These often involved communication with ancestors through trance, where the Sangoma would enter an altered state and allow ancestral spirits to speak through them, offering guidance and healing to the warrior. There was something deeply comforting in believing your ancestors, who were also warriors, who also faced difficulties, were actively involved in your healing. You weren't alone. You had generations behind you supporting, guiding. The Yoruba of West Africa had specific societies, like the Egungun, dedicated to honoring ancestors through dance and masked performance. Warriors could participate in these societies and through elaborate rituals connect with lineage of warriors who came before. The mask didn't just hide identity, it allowed you to temporarily become the ancestor, see through their eyes, gain their wisdom. And there's that fascinating aspect of masks that deserves attention. In many African cultures, masks aren't decoration, they're spiritual technology. When you put on a specific mask, you're not pretending to be something else. You're becoming something else, at least temporarily. For a warrior struggling with identity, who am I if I'm not a warrior? This technology of temporary transformation was valuable. You could experiment with other identities through masks. You could be the wise one, the healer, the storyteller, the sacred fool. And each mask offered different perspective, reminded you that identity is more fluid than we think. There are interesting parallels with some modern theatrical practices used in therapy, drama therapy, psychodrama, where assuming different roles helps process experiences. African communities also understood the importance of keeping warriors engaged and useful after conflict. They weren't just left to wander without purpose, they were given specific roles. Teaching the young, helping in village defense, participating in elder councils when old enough. There was a structure of progression. You were young warrior, then established warrior, then veteran, then eventually elder, who no longer fought, but whose counsel was essential. Each stage had its own honor. Aging didn't mean becoming irrelevant. It meant gaining new form of value. The age-set systems in many African societies facilitated this. You progressed through life with your group, men born approximately the same time as you. You were initiated together, trained together, fought together, and eventually aged together. This group cohesion throughout life offered constant support network. Your age mates understood what you went through because they went through the same things. There was no need to explain. There was implicit, shared understanding. Women also had crucial roles. In many cultures, it was women, especially older ones, who knew herbs, who conducted certain purification rituals, who sang specific songs that calmed disturbed spirits. And after public rituals, it was often mothers, sisters, wives who did the quiet work of daily reintegration, preparing specific foods that had meaning, not just nutrition, but memory, comfort, home, maintaining domestic routines that offered structure and normalcy, being patiently present when warrior was ready to talk, and respectfully silent when he wasn't. The relationship between warriors and traditional healers, sangomas, nangas, babalawos, depending on culture, also deserves mention. These weren't just herb doctors. They were spiritual psychologists, counselors, bridges between physical and spiritual world. A warrior struggling with nightmares, with spiritual restlessness, with sensation of being haunted by spirits of the dead, could consult a healer. And treatment would be holistic. It would involve herbs, yes, but also ritual, counsel, sometimes divination, to understand spiritual roots of the problem. The healer might determine the warrior needed to make offering to ancestors, or needed specific spiritual cleansing, or needed to reconcile with spirits of those he killed, and then would guide appropriate rituals. This offered a framework of meaning. Your suffering wasn't random or sign of weakness. It was spiritual problem with spiritual solution. And this, regardless of whether we believe in the specific cosmology, had real psychological effect. Drums deserve more attention because they were central to almost all these processes. African drums aren't just musical instruments. They're tools of communication, healing, consciousness alteration. Specific rhythms induce specific states. Some rhythms are energizing, make you want to move. Others are calming, lower your heart rate. Still others are hypnotic, facilitate trance. And playing drums, not just listening but participating, is therapeutic in itself. The physical impact of hand on leather. The reverberation you feel in body. The need for coordination, timing, attention. All this anchors you in the present moment in powerful ways. Warriors often learned to play drums as part of recovery. It was a way to channel energy, to express emotion without words, to reconnect with fundamental rhythms of heart, of breath, of steps, of natural cycles. Interesting how so many cultures arrived at the conclusion that rhythm and percussion were essential for healing. There was also elaborate oral tradition. Stories of ancestral heroes, epics told over entire nights by griots, professional storytellers. And these stories served similar functions to Viking sagas or Greek tragedies, offered models, contextualized suffering, reminded listeners of shared values. A particularly popular story, in many variations across Africa, tells about warrior who went to war and lost his shadow. He returned victorious but empty, because part of him stayed behind. And the story tells his journey to recover his shadow, through challenges, rituals, help from spirits and animals. And in the end, he learns his shadow was never really lost. It was just waiting for him to become whole enough to receive it back. This metaphor of losing and recovering shadow, of needing to change before becoming complete again, resonated deeply with warriors experiencing dissociation or loss of sense of self. And as bonfires burn low, as the last dancer finally sits, as drums diminish to whisper before silencing completely, the entire village breathes together. Something has been completed, not permanently, perfectly. Healing is always an ongoing process, but something important has been marked, witnessed, honored, and the warrior, now simply man again, walks to his hut. His feet know the way even in darkness, and when he lies on the familiar mat, hearing familiar night sounds, crickets, distant owl call, soft breathing of sleeping family, for the first time in a long while, he feels something resembling peace. Only all this African wisdom, however rich and deep, represents just a fraction of human traditions of processing trauma and finding the way back to wholeness. And when we turn our gaze to different times and places, we find that challenges may change, but fundamental human needs, for ritual, for community, for meaning, for transformation, remain constant. And bringing together all these threads, seeing patterns that emerge when we compare these diverse traditions, this reveals something essential about what it means to be human, to be wounded, and to find healing. Return to Earth. There's something deeply restorative about working with Earth. Not Earth as abstract concept, but literal Earth. Soil between your fingers, the damp smell of humus, the sensation of planting something and seeing it grow. And across cultures and centuries, warriors returning from conflict discovered that reconnection with Earth was often a crucial part of finding peace again. It wasn't coincidence. There was something about this relationship with soil, plants, cycles of growth that spoke directly to parts of us that war disturbed. Where battle is chaos, gardening is order. Where violence destroys, cultivation creates. Where death dominates, growth offers perfect antidote. Imagine a veteran, doesn't matter from which culture or era, walking toward a field for the first time after returning. Maybe it's a field his family always cultivated. Maybe it's a piece of land he claimed as reward for service. Maybe it's simply a garden behind a temple where he's temporarily living. He stops at the edge, looking at exposed soil. And something in him, something that's been tense for so long he forgot how to relax, begins to loosen because Earth doesn't judge. Doesn't care what you did, how many battles you fought, how many ghosts you carry. Earth simply is. Waits, ready to receive seeds, to nurture growth, to participate in the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth that's much older than any human conflict. And then he kneels. The movement is almost instinctive, lowering himself, getting closer to ground. His hands touch soil. It's cold, damp, from recent rain. The texture is complex, grains of sand, pieces of clay, decomposing organic matter. It's real in a way many things aren't. He takes a handful, lets it run between fingers. And there's something meditative about this. The weight, the texture, the smell, rich, earthy, alive. His brain, which has been in survival mode for so long, receives signal. This is safe. This is natural. You can lower your guard here. Have we lost something important by disconnecting from literal contact with Earth? In Rome, there was proud tradition of generals becoming farmers. Cincinnatus is the most famous example. Called from his plough to lead army, saved Rome, and then immediately returned to his farm. Not from lack of ambition, but because he genuinely preferred rural life. And this wasn't seen as failure or waste of talent, it was seen as ideal. The true Roman citizen was someone who could fight when necessary, but preferred to cultivate. Someone whose primary identity wasn't warrior, but farmer. Retired legionaries often received land as payment for years of service, and part of the logic was practical, spreading Roman citizens through conquered territories. But there was deeper wisdom too, giving a veteran a piece of land, tools, seeds, and purpose of making it productive was giving structure for transition back to civilian life. The first months were hard. Farm work is physically demanding in different ways from combat. It's constant, repetitive, without battle's adrenaline but with its own intensity. You wake with sun, work until dark, there's always more to do. But in this constancy was healing. Your days had natural structure, dictated not by commanders or strategies, but by seasons, by plant needs, by ancient rhythms of sowing and reaping. And gradually, your own internal rhythm began to synchronize with these slower, more natural rhythms. Planting was especially significant, making hole in soil, placing seed, so small, seemingly fragile, covering with earth, watering, and then waiting. You can't rush, can't force. All you can do is create right conditions and trust the process. For someone accustomed to trying to control everything, to always being vigilant, this surrender to natural timing of things was difficult, but necessary lesson. You learn humility, you learn patience, you learn that some things simply take the time they take. And then days or weeks later, you see first green sprout emerging. So small, so delicate, but carrying incredible strength, the force of life persisting, pushing through soil, reaching for light. There's something deeply moving about this. You, who saw so much destruction, are now witness and facilitator of creation. That small sprout exists because of your hands, your work, your care. And this recalibrates something inside you about what your hands are capable of. Curious how the act of nurturing growth can be a powerful antidote to having caused death, isn't it? In China and Japan, there was long tradition of retired warriors becoming gardeners or tea cultivators, not as hobby, but as continued spiritual practice. The same focus, the same discipline they applied to martial arts, they now applied to cultivating plants. The gardens they created were living works of art, each stone positioned intentionally. Each plant chosen not just for beauty, but for symbolic meaning. Pines representing longevity, bamboos representing flexibility and resilience, cherry trees representing life's impermanence. And working in these gardens was active meditation. You didn't just throw plants in ground, you considered composition, balance, energy flow. You pruned with total attention. Each cut deliberate, made at right time, for right reason. Very different from cutting in battle. This cutting promoted life, didn't take it. Watering was its own ritual. Water flowing gently from copper watering can over delicate leaves. The soothing sound. The visual transformation when water touches dry soil. Darkening, releasing that unmistakable smell of earth being refreshed. You could spend an hour watering small garden, completely absorbed in task, and over time, garden became mirror. When you were agitated internally, you tended to overwork garden, pruning too much, reorganizing unnecessarily. And garden suffered. When you found internal balance, garden thrived. There was constant feedback, teaching you to recognize your own states through how you interacted with plants. Zen monks had expression. The garden is severe but fair teacher. You can't lie to garden, can't pretend. If you didn't care for it appropriately, plants show. If you overdid care, plants show that too. And slowly, you learn balance. Between doing and not doing, between care and allowing autonomy. In medieval Europe, Many monasteries were self-sufficient, with extensive herb gardens, vegetables, orchards, and warriors who came to these monasteries seeking peace often spent time working in gardens. Monks understood the value of this. It wasn't just practical work to produce food, it was therapy. Working with medicinal herbs was especially valued. Learning to cultivate plants that healed. You planted chamomile for calming teas, lavender for oils that relieved anxiety, valerian for insomnia, and there was powerful symbolism. You, who caused wounds, now cultivated cures. You were literally cultivating medicines, and in the process of doing this, were becoming guardian of plants that alleviated suffering. Part of your own pain was alleviated too. Orchards were especially valued. Planting fruit tree is an extraordinary act of faith. You probably won't see full harvest for years. Apple trees, pear trees, cherries take time to mature. You're planting for future, for people who will come after you. For veteran, struggling with sense of futility, of nothing mattering, planting trees that will live for decades or centuries offers powerful counter-narrative. You're literally creating future. You're contributing to something that transcends your individual life. Curious, isn't it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. There was also practice of beekeeping. Keeping bees may seem strange choice, but there was wisdom in it. Bees are complex social creatures, highly organized, incredibly hardworking. Observing them, learning their rhythms, caring for them without trying to completely control them, all this taught valuable lessons. And bees didn't tolerate rushing or aggression. If you approached hives stressed, agitated, they sensed it and reacted defensively. You had to calm yourself first, move slowly, be present. It was training in emotional regulation, disguised as practical work. And then there was sweet reward. Literally. Honey you harvested with your own hands. There was deep satisfaction in that. You worked with nature, respected its creatures, and were rewarded. It wasn't transaction, it was cooperation, partnership with something wild but accessible. In many cultures, there was tradition of veterans becoming shepherds. This may seem solitary work, but there was healing in it too. Spending days in open pastures, moving slowly with flock, having only sheep or goats as company. The rhythm was determined by animals, where they wanted to graze, when they needed rest, when they needed to be guided to water, and caring for animals, especially young ones, activated protective instincts in healthy ways. An orphaned lamb needing bottle feeding. You woke several times per night, prepared warm milk, held tiny creature while it nursed. Your caring instincts, which may have been suppressed or distorted by war, now found appropriate expression. And sheep, despite reputation for being dumb, are surprisingly sensitive to shepherds' emotional state. When you're calm, they're calm. When you're agitated, they sense it and get nervous. So you learn to regulate yourself not for your own sake, but because animals under your care need you to be centered. Herding dogs added another layer. Working relationship between human and herding dog is something special. It's not just commands and obedience. It's subtle communication, cooperation, mutual trust. And for someone perhaps struggling to trust or be trusted by other humans, building this partnership with dog offered first step back toward connection. There was also tradition in many cultures of veterans becoming fishermen, not large-scale ocean fishing, but river or lake fishing, quiet, contemplative. You sit on bank or in small boat, line in water and... Wait, the waiting is the point. It's not about catching as many fish as possible, it's about being present, observing nature, letting mind calm. You watch dragonflies landing on water surface. Hear birds in branches above. Feel gentle breeze on skin. See light patterns reflecting on water. And when fish finally bites, if it bites, there's a moment of intense but not stressful focus. You respond, pull gently, work with fish's movement. And when it's in net, there's satisfaction. You provided food through patience and skill, not through violence. Preparing fish to eat, cleaning it carefully, cooking it over fire you lit yourself, completes circle, from lake to fire to table. There's integrity in this process that modern feeding often loses, and participating in this complete cycle offers sense of connection with basic life systems. The seasons also taught. Spring brought explosion of growth. Everything sprouting at once, color returning to landscapes that had been brown and gray. It was impossible to witness this without feeling something of hope, of renewal. Even if you personally were still struggling, the world around demonstrated that new beginnings were always possible. Summer was work, maintaining gardens, harvesting what was ready, preparing for future seasons. But it was meaningful work, work that showed direct results. At day's end, you saw what you'd done. Piles of harvested vegetables, weeded rows, mended fence, tangible, visible, real. Autumn brought main harvest to the moment to see if your year's work had been enough. And there was deep satisfaction in full barn, in stored provisions, in knowing you cared for land appropriately and it cared for you in return. And winter was rest. Work naturally diminished. Not from laziness, but because it was time for earth to rest, for plants to enter dormancy. And you could rest too, sit near fire, repair tools, plan next season, but mainly allow yourself simplicity of not doing much. Learning that rest isn't weakness, that it's necessary part of cycle. It was a crucial lesson for many who had been conditioned to always be productive, always vigilant. Have we lost wisdom about importance of natural cycles of activity and rest? There was also communal element in farm work. Large harvests often needed many hands. Neighbors helped each other, and working side by side, cutting wheat, gathering hay, picking apples, created camaraderie different but equally strong as battle camaraderie. It was cooperation without competition. Everyone benefited when they helped each other. And for veteran perhaps feeling he had no place in civil society, being useful in this concrete way, being part of communal effort that fed families, offered renewed purpose. Communal meals after harvests were special. Food everyone helped produce, prepared and shared. There was no rigid hierarchy. Landlord ate alongside workers. There was temporary democracy of shared exhaustion and shared satisfaction. And often, while eating, stories were shared. Not necessarily war stories, stories about past seasons, about exceptional harvest 10 years ago, about storm that almost destroyed everything but community recovered, stories that put present challenges in context of long-term resilience. Farm animals also taught death differently. Goat you raised eventually ages and dies, or needs to be slaughtered for eating, and you learn about death that's part of cycle, not violation of it. You learn to honor animals' life by giving it good life and quick death, without suffering. It's different from death in war, which is often premature, chaotic, without clear meaning. Death on farm has place, has purpose, happens in appropriate time, and witnessing this repeatedly helps recontextualize death from chaotic to natural. And then there's something simple but profound about being tired the right way at day's end. Not exhausted from adrenaline and stress, but tired from honest physical work. Your muscles ache, but in satisfying way. Your hands are dirty, you smell of earth and sun, and when you lie down at night, you sleep. Not shallow, agitated sleep full of nightmares, but deep, restorative sleep. Because your body worked as it was designed to work. It's genuinely tired, and night is for resting. A story that illustrates this well is about Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, brilliant Roman general, close friend of Emperor Augustus. he could have had powerful political career. Instead, in his final years, he retired to rural property. He wrote letters describing joy of simple tasks, of planting olive trees, of supervising grape harvest, of improving irrigation. It wasn't pretense or rich man's hobby. He genuinely found more satisfaction in this than in military glory or political power, and this wasn't seen as waste. It was seen as wisdom. He had done what he needed to do in public sphere. Now he was doing what he wanted to do. And what he wanted was to work with Earth, see things grow, be part of something more fundamental than politics. And as sun sets over freshly ploughed field, casting long shadows through furrows in earth, as birds begin their evening chorus, a man leans on his hoe. His back aches, his hands have new calluses, but there's smile on his face, small but real. Because today he planted. And in weeks these fields will be green with new life. Life he helped create, not destroy. And in this simple inversion, something fundamental heals. Only reconnection with Earth, however powerful, is just one of many ways humans have found to process trauma and rebuild life after war. And there's still more wisdom waiting to be discovered. Practices we haven't fully explored. Cultures whose traditions deserve attention, aspects of healing that transcend any single tradition. The guardians of return. In practically all warrior cultures throughout history, there was a truth that rarely appears in battle books or military chronicles. Women were often the true architects of reintegration, not in the sense of commanding armies or conducting public ceremonies, though some did that too, but in the quiet, constant, deeply skilled work of reconnecting warriors with their humanity. It wasn't passive work. It wasn't simply being there. It was active, intentional labor, carrying knowledge transmitted through generations of women who had received back fathers, brothers, husbands, sons from wars and knew exactly what needed to be done. Imagine an ancient Greek woman waiting. Her husband is returning from years fighting in the Persian wars. She's received message that he's alive, that he's on his way. And she doesn't just sit, anxious. She prepares. First, the house. Not just cleaning, though that too, but creating specific environment. She burns specific herbs, lavender, rosemary, that fill the air with aromas he remembered from before the war. Smells are powerful memory triggers, and she knows she needs to anchor him in memories of home, not battlefield. She prepares his favorite food, not elaborate banquet, but simple dishes he loved as child. Lentils with cumin, barley bread with honey, olives cured the way his mother did. Each flavor is thread pulling him back to life that existed before, to identity that was more than warrior. She talks to the children, explains father may be different, that he needs patience, that they shouldn't run to him immediately with all their energy, however much they want to, but let him approach in his own time. She's managing entire family dynamic, creating space for gradual transition, and when he finally arrives, she doesn't bombard him with questions, doesn't demand explanations or reports. There's embrace, long, silent. And then she simply says, "You're home. Dinner will be ready when you want it." Seems simple, but in this simplicity there's profound wisdom. She's establishing no pressure, no immediate expectations. You have space to simply be without having to do or explain yet. Do we underestimate the power of pressure-free space in healing trauma? Roman women had even more structured role. Legionaries' wives often formed informal support networks. When a group of soldiers returned, women gathered and shared strategies. What worked, what didn't. warning signs to watch for, ways to help without smothering. There was collective wisdom being transmitted. A veteran of these gatherings, woman whose husband had returned from previous campaigns and eventually found peace, could guide younger wife receiving husband for first time. He'll want to be alone sometimes. Let him. But always leave door open, literally and figuratively, so when he's ready, he knows he can come back. Don't expect him to talk about everything, but when he does speak, just listen. Don't try to fix. Don't offer solutions. Just witness. Keep routines, same meal times, same daily rituals. Predictability is comforting when everything else seems chaotic. Take care of yourself too. You can't be source of strength if you're exhausted. Find your own friends, your own support. This transmission of practical knowledge from woman to woman was invisible but essential support system. And there's fascinating aspect. Many of these women had their own forms of trauma. Months or years managing everything alone. Constant worry. Sometimes news that he was wounded or dead or missing. And then information proved inaccurate, but emotional damage was already done. So when he returned, both had processing to do, not just his. And wise women recognized this, created space for both journeys to happen simultaneously, sometimes intertwined, sometimes parallel. In Viking culture, women had unique status and power. They weren't just household managers, though they were excellent at that. Many were landowners in their own right. Some were vulvas, priestesses and seers. And when warriors returned, these women had real authority in reintegration process. A vulva could perform Seder ritual, form of Norse magic, shamanism, specifically for returning warrior. It involved trance, communication with spirits, divination. But beyond mystical aspect, there were profound psychological components. Warrior would sit while vulva entered trance. And she spoke, sometimes as herself, sometimes channeling ancestral spirits, sometimes in voices that seemed to come from elsewhere. And what she said often directly addressed warriors' unspoken fears and guilts. The dead don't blame you, they understood what war requires. Your honor isn't stained, you did what you needed to do. The path back is long, but you don't walk alone. Your ancestors walk beside you. They were statements, yes, but they were statements with spiritual authority. And for culture that deeply believed in spiritual world, hearing this from vulva had immense weight. It was almost like absolution, but coming from source that transcended common human judgment. Viking wives also had specific practice of weaving husband stories into tapestries, literally. She would take events he shared, sometimes fragments, sometimes more complete narratives, and transform them into woven images. The act of weaving itself was meditative. The repetitive rhythm, the focus needed. But more than that, she was transforming his words into visual art that whole family could see. She was helping him process by giving visual form to his experience. And when tapestry was complete, which could take months, it was hung in hall. Part of family story now. Not hidden, not shameful, but integrated. And children would grow up seeing that tapestry, learning father's story as part of family heritage. Curious how transforming narrative into visual art can be form of processing, isn't it? In African cultures, elder women had especially important roles. They were ones who knew herbs, who knew which roots cured insomnia, which leaves made tea to calm agitated spirits, which tree barks helped with nightmares. But more than that, they knew stories. Stories of other warriors who returned, who struggled, who eventually found peace. And they would sit with troubled young warrior and tell these stories, not as moral lesson, but as company, as saying, "You're not the first. Others walked this path and found way out." Mothers had particular role. In many cultures, it was mother who conducted first reconnection ritual. She would wash son's feet, act of humility but also powerful reversal. He, who was warrior, commander perhaps, now is receiving basic physical care from his mother. The warm water, the gentle touch of her hands cleaning each foot, massaging tired muscles, drying with soft cloth. It's infantilizing in deliberate way, reminding him of time before adult responsibilities, when being cared for was natural and safe. And while doing this, she often hummed. Not necessarily songs with words, just melodies, perhaps something she sang when he was baby, the sound, the vibration, the deep sensory recognition. I knew you before you were warrior, and I know you beyond that too. Sisters had different role. They could be more direct, less reverent. A sister could tease brother in ways that restored normalcy. You return from war and still haven't learned not to leave boots at entrance? There's affection in this, but also refusal to treat him as fragile or broken, and this is balancing. Everyone else may be walking on eggshells around him, but sister treats him as always treated, with mixture of love and exasperation, that sibling hallmark. And this reminds him, you're still you, not just what happened to you. Daughters, especially small daughters, had power of their own. A child doesn't understand trauma subtleties. She just sees father and wants to play. Wants him to throw her in air like he used to. Wants to show him drawing she made. And initially, this may be too much. He may not have energy, may not be able to connect. But child's gentle persistence, who comes back day after day with same uncomplicated hope, eventually penetrates, because it's hard to maintain defenses against child's pure, agenda-free joy. There were accounts of warriors who remained closed for weeks, not responding to wives, mothers, friends. But then 5-year-old daughter climbed in his lap with storybook, and something melted, because she wanted nothing more than proximity and attention. No judgment, no complex expectations, just simple love. Do we underestimate children as healing agents? In medieval Japan, there was tradition of wives preparing special yukata, light cotton robe, for returning husbands. It was sewn specifically for him, with patterns chosen thinking of his taste, of shared memories. And when he arrived, before anything else, she led him to bath she'd prepared. Hot water perfumed with yuzu, Japanese citrus that has unique aroma, fresh but comforting. And afterward, she helped him put on new yukata. There's something about wearing new, clean clothes made specifically for you with care and love. It's almost like new skin, and combined with purifying bath, creates visceral sensation of being able to start again. Samurai wives also practiced ikebana, flower arrangement, in specific ways for returning husbands. Not elaborate, perfect arrangements, but arrangements that intentionally included asymmetric, imperfect elements. Reminding of wabi-sabi principle, beauty in imperfection. The message was subtle but clear. Perfection isn't goal. Beauty exists in incompleteness. You don't need to be fixed to be valued. In medieval Europe, there was tradition of wives and mothers embroidering. And when warrior was on campaign, they often embroidered something specific for him. A handkerchief, a sash, a piece of fabric he could carry. But what many don't know is that these embroideries often contain protective symbols, prayers sewn into patterns, and even coded messages in color sequences and stitches. It was a way to maintain connection, to send love and protection across distance. And when he returned, she continued embroidering. But now would embroider pieces of his story, symbols of places he mentioned, abstract representations of things he'd seen. And these embroidered pieces became visual records of his experiences, but filtered through her interpretation and care. It was collaboration. He provided raw story, she transformed into art, and together they created something that belonged to both. Women's communities also gathered regularly. In Rome, at public women's baths. In Greece, at festivals exclusive to women like Thesmophoria. In Nordic countries, at communal houses during collective weaving. In Africa, at specific female rituals. And in these spaces, away from male eyes, they talked. Shared burdens, confessed fears, laughed. Often laughed, because humor was necessary. Escape valve, cried together, offered advice. My husband wakes, screaming every night. Mine did that too, took months, but gradually diminished. I started singing softly when it happened, not to wake him, but so if he woke he'd have comforting sound waiting, and it worked. Eventually, it's not magic, but it helped. These exchanges, practical, honest, rooted in lived experience, were invaluable. They were like field manual passed from veteran to rookie, but organic manual, always updated with new situations and solutions. And women cared for each other too. If one was exhausted from dealing with particularly difficult husband, others intervened, brought food, cared for children for a day, sat and just offered presence, allowing her to safely fall apart. Because they understood you can't pour care from empty cup. You need to be filled too. There was also category of women in many cultures. War widows. Women whose husbands didn't return. And they had unique and complicated role. On one hand, they represented worst fear. On other, they often became sources of wisdom about loss and continuity. A widow who had processed her grief, who had found way to continue, to raise children alone, to find meaning despite loss. She had special moral authority. When she spoke about resilience, about honoring dead by living well, about not letting pain define you completely, people listened. And for warriors carrying survivors' guilt, meeting widow who didn't blame them, who in fact was grateful that someone returned, who saw in them living connection to lost husband, this could be liberating. He would have wanted you to live well, to find joy. Living well honors his sacrifice, doesn't shame it. Simple words. But coming from someone who paid ultimate price, they had weight no one else could give. The healers, shamans, midwives, faith healers, women who moved between physical and spiritual world, also had specialized knowledge. They understood that trauma wasn't just physical, not just mental, but something that affected whole person, including spiritual dimension, and treatments reflected this. A Brazilian faith healer, for example, might do specific prayer over returning warrior. Involved prayers, yes, but also specific gestures, use of branches to clean air around him, holy water, salt. And warrior could feel something shifting. Not necessarily because he believed in specific theology, but because complete multisensory ritual, done with intention and authority by someone who clearly knew what they were doing, had effect. Healer's touch was also different, not sexual, not romantic, but deeply intimate, touching specific body points that were holding trauma, massaging areas of deep tension, and while doing this, whispering, prayers, incantations, or simply comforting sounds that were more about tone than words. Women also maintained memory. When men died, it was women who usually kept stories alive, who told children about grandfather, about uncle, about father they never knew, who preserved not just facts, but essence, how he laughed, what he loved, his little habits. And this was gift to those who returned, knowing that if something happened to them, they wouldn't be forgotten, that there was network of memory and story guaranteeing continuity beyond individual life. In cultures with tradition of reincarnation or afterlife, women were often ones maintaining connection with ancestors, who made offerings, who kept domestic altars, who ensured dead were honored, and living remained connected to chain of generations. And for warrior feeling, he'd cut connections, that he was floating without roots, participating in these domestic rituals, so different from public, formal rituals, could be profoundly grounding. Reminded him he was part of something greater than war, greater than his individual life. Was link in long chain extending behind and ahead of him. A story that captures this well. There was Zulu warrior who returned so traumatized he couldn't speak. Weeks passed, public rituals were done, elders intervened. Nothing. Finally, his grandmother, tiny woman but with enormous presence, sat with him. Didn't speak, didn't ask anything, just started grinding corn as always did, the rhythmic sound, the repetitive movement. And eventually, he picked up another stone and started helping her. Days passed like this, just sitting together, grinding corn in silence. And gradually, he began making small sounds, then word fragments, then sentences, not about war, about corn, about weather, about simple things, and through these small, trivial conversations, eventually path was paved for bigger conversations. But grandmother never rushed, just continued offering silent presence and shared work until he was ready. And as last light of day disappears, as a woman lights lamp in window, universal signal of welcome home, as she hears familiar footsteps approaching a long dark road, she takes deep breath. She's done her preparation. House is ready. She's ready. And when door opens, when she sees his face, older, more tired, but still him, she simply smiles and says most powerful thing she can say, "Welcome home, I've been waiting." But women's work, however crucial, is just part of bigger picture. There are still other dimensions of how ancient societies created support networks, other practices that integrated multiple elements, work, community, spirituality, into comprehensive healing systems. And seeing how all these pieces fit together, this reveals something about wisdom we may have lost, and that's worth recovering. Ancient wisdom, eternal truths. So said when you look across all these cultures, from Roman baths to African drums, from Mongol steppes to Zen gardens, from Viking sagas to medieval pilgrimages, you begin to see patterns, not coincidences, but shared recognition of fundamental truths about what it means to be human, to be wounded, and to find the way back to wholeness. These ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries, with no possibility of communication between them, independently arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. And this suggests something profound, that there's wisdom about trauma and healing that's almost universal, inscribed in human nature itself. Let's explore these patterns, not as academic list, but as threads woven together, each strengthening others, creating tapestry of understanding that transcends any specific culture. The journey is the process. Almost every tradition recognizes that healing doesn't happen instantly. It's not a switch you flip. It's a journey, often literal. Romans walking around city outskirts before entering, Mongols riding alone across steppe, medieval knights making pilgrimages of months, Africans being led through multi-day rituals. Physical movement itself had meaning. It wasn't just about reaching destination, it was about the process of crossing distance, of letting time pass, of allowing the very act of moving through space to facilitate movement through emotional states. And there was wisdom in this. Trauma often freezes us. We get stuck in moment, reliving repeatedly. Intentional physical movement, especially prolonged movement requiring attention but not complex thought, helps unfreeze, creates visceral sensation of progress, of no longer being stuck. Modern science confirms this. Repetitive bilateral movement, walking, rowing, riding, has specific neurological effects. helps reprocess traumatic memories, integrate fragmented experiences. But ancients already knew this, not through MRI, but through careful observation and wisdom transmission. It's not done. Alone no culture expected warrior to process everything alone. There was always community, structured in different ways, but always present. Elders who'd been through it, women who cared, companions who understood, rituals that included everyone's participation. This universal insistence on healing as communal process goes against much of modern individualistic approach. We often think, I need to fix myself. But ancients would say, you can't, and you shouldn't have to try. You heal by being received back, by being included, by being reminded you belong. It wasn't dependence, it was interdependence. Recognition that humans are social animals and that isolation, especially after trauma, is poison, while connection is medicine. And there was subtlety in this. It wasn't smothering. It wasn't everyone constantly in your face demanding you talk or process. It was creating structure of available presence. You could choose when to engage, but knew that when ready, there would be people there. Not judging, just there. Rituals. Mark transitions. All cultures had elaborate rituals to mark return. Not casual celebrations, but structured ceremonies that clearly said, something changed. You left as one thing and returned as another. Now there's process of becoming something new. Rituals served multiple functions, publicly acknowledged warriors' experience, offered clear temporal structure. There's before, there's during, there's after. Created liminal space where transformation could happen safely and contained, and involved body as much as mind. This is crucial. Trauma isn't just mental, it's stored in body, in muscle tensions, in altered breathing patterns, in nervous system remaining in threat mode, and rituals involving physical action, dancing, walking, being bathed, being anointed, working with earth, addressed this bodily dimension directly. You can't simply think your way out of trauma. You need to feel it through, move it through, process it in ways involving entire organism. Nature is teacher and healer from Mongol steppes to Zen gardens, from Nordic fjords to Roman fields. Reconnection with nature was constant theme. And not domesticated, controlled nature, but nature on its own terms, vast, indifferent to human problems, operating on time scales that made individual conflicts seem momentary. There's something deeply therapeutic about being in presence of something much larger than you. Night sky full of stars, ocean stretching to horizon, mountain that's existed for millennia. This offers perspective that mind alone can't generate. Your problems don't disappear, but they're contextualized. You see you're part of something much larger that will continue far beyond you. And paradoxically, this is comforting. The weight of individual responsibility is shared with something infinitely more vast. And working with nature, planting, harvesting, caring for animals, observing seasons, reconnects you with fundamental cycles: birth, growth, death, rebirth. Not abstractly, but tangibly. You see with own eyes that new beginnings are possible, that life persists, that spring always comes after winter. Narrative transforms experience. Viking sagas, Greek tragedies, African tales around fire, medieval confessions, all recognized that transforming raw experience into structured narrative was an essential part of processing. But not just any narrative, there was art to it. Story needed to have form, beginning, middle, end, challenges and resolutions, context connecting individual event to larger patterns. And often, narrative was created not just by warrior, but collaboratively, with poet, with priest, with community, with women who wove story into tapestries. This narrativization fulfilled several functions: created safe distance. You're telling story, not reliving trauma. Allowed finding meaning. Stories have causal structure, sequences that make sense. Offered witnessing audience. Someone listened, validated, acknowledged, and transformed memory from something that happened to you to something that happened through you and now belonged to collective cultural patrimony. Modern science of narrative therapy rediscovers this, retelling traumatic experiences in structured ways, especially rewriting narratives in ways that restore agency and meaning, is provenly effective. But ancients practiced this for millennia. Time is required. No culture expected instant healing. Romans had weeks or months of structured transition. Mongols allowed long solitary rides. Samurai could spend years in temples. Knights made pilgrimages lasting entire seasons. There was patient recognition that deep transformation simply takes time, can't be rushed. Trying to force only creates superficial appearance of recovery, while deep wounds remain unprocessed. And time wasn't empty. It was filled with practices, meditation, manual work, participation in rituals, reconnection with nature, narrative building. But all these practices respected that there's natural rhythm to healing that can't be violated. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is the most reflective part. The story is coming to an end. Our modern culture often treats healing as project with deadline. How long will it take? When will I be better? And while wanting certainty is understandable, ancients would say these are wrong questions. Healing isn't destination you reach. It's ongoing process of integration, of learning to carry experiences differently. Multiple dimensions must be addressed. No tradition treated healing as purely physical or purely mental or purely spiritual. All recognized humans are complex. We have bodies, minds, spirits, and all are intertwined. So approaches were holistic. Baths and massages for body, meditation and philosophy for mind, rituals and connection with ancestors for spirit, manual work engaging everything simultaneously, community recognizing social dimension of who we are. Specialization has value, but ancients understood that when it comes to deep trauma, fragmenting person into components and treating each separately can miss something essential. You are wholeness, and true healing needs to address that wholeness, art and beauty. Our medicinal Greeks with their tragedies and architecture, Japanese with tea ceremonies and gardens, Africans with elaborate dance and drums, Vikings with poetically refined sagas, medievals with Gregorian chant and cathedrals. All these cultures invested heavily in creating beauty, not as luxury, but as necessity, and ensured returning warriors had access to this beauty. Why? Because beauty does something rational arguments can't. It reminds you there's more in world than violence and suffering, that humans are capable of creating sublime things, that civilization is worth protecting and preserving, and participating in beauty creation, and whether through calligraphy or gardening or dance or craftsmanship, restores sense that your hands can do more than destroy. They can create, they can contribute to some of beauty in world. Renewed purpose is essential. No culture simply left veterans without purpose. There were always roles for them, as elders, as farmers, as mentors, as tradition guardians, as storytellers. Purpose changed. You were no longer active warrior, but that didn't mean you were useless. It meant you were in different life phase with different contributions to make. And these contributions were valued. This is crucial because much post-trauma suffering comes from loss of identity and purpose. If I'm not a warrior, who am I? And culture that doesn't offer good answer to this question leaves veteran adrift. But cultures that said, now you're guardian of wisdom, or now you nurture next generation, or now you work with earth, offered new meaning structure. You still had place. You still mattered. Just differently. Balance. Between remembering and letting go, there's interesting tension in how ancient cultures approached memory. On one hand, they honored warriors' experiences, created memorials, told stories, didn't say just forget. But on the other hand, all had release practices. Stones buried in steppe, offerings burned in fires, confessions and absolutions, rituals of letting go. The wisdom wasn't forget, nor was it hold forever. It was something more nuanced. Remember, but transform how you carry it. Integrate, but don't let it define you completely. Honor, but also release what no longer serves. And this is delicate balance that can only be navigated individually with support over time. Transformation is possible, perhaps most important pattern. All these cultures believed transformation was possible. Disturbed warrior wasn't permanently broken. With right practices, with adequate support, with sufficient time, he could find peace. Not return to what he was before. You can't undo experiences, but forward movement to new state of wholeness. There was grounded optimism in this. Not naive optimism denying difficulty, but confidence based on generational observation. People can heal. Not all, not completely, not without scars, but heal sufficiently to live well, to find joy, to contribute, to belong. And this optimism itself was therapeutic. When entire community believes in your capacity to recover, when there are living examples of others who did it, when there are clear paths to follow, all this creates context where recovery becomes more likely. Self-fulfilling prophecy in best sense. We believe you can heal, so we create structures facilitating healing, so you heal, which reinforces our belief, which strengthens structures, which helps next person. What we lost, what we can recover. Looking at all this ancient wisdom, it's hard not to feel we've lost something. Our modern approach to trauma, though it has benefits of science and medicine, is often fragmented, individualistic, medicalized in ways ignoring communal, ritual, spiritual dimensions of healing. Modern veterans often return to societies that don't know what to do with them. There are no clear transition rituals, no defined roles waiting. Communities are dispersed, not cohesive. Nuclear family replaced extended networks. Specialists treat specific symptoms, but nobody addresses whole person. And many veterans struggle not because they're weaker than ancient warriors, but because support structures that existed universally in ancient cultures no longer exist, or exist in diminished forms. But perhaps it's not too late to recover some of this wisdom. Not copy exactly. Our world is different. But adapt principles to modern context. Create transition rituals, even informal. Build intentional support communities, reconnect with nature, invest in art and beauty, tell and retell stories until they find healing form. Recognize healing takes time and create space for that time. Address whole person, not just specific symptoms. Offer renewed purpose. These things are possible, not easy perhaps, but possible. And as this journey through cultures and centuries nears its end, as we've seen Romans in their baths and Mongols in their steppes and samurai in their gardens and all others finding their unique paths back to peace, there's one last question to contemplate. What does all this mean for us today? Now? How do we take these lessons from millennia and apply them in modern world? Not academically or abstractly, but in ways that actually help people who are suffering now. This final reflection, this synthesis of everything we've explored, this application of ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges, that's what remains. And that's what comes next. The path continues. There's something all these stories share, something that transcends Roman temples and Mongol steppes, Zen gardens and Viking halls, African rituals and medieval pilgrimages. It's not specific technique or unique practice. It's something more fundamental, the recognition that being wounded is not the end of the story. It's just a chapter. And that there's always possibility of next chapters. Think about all the warriors we met on this journey. The Roman legionary sitting by the Tiber, letting water run between his fingers. The Mongol rider alone, under infinite starry sky. The samurai in rock garden, raking sand in patterns that will be undone by wind and remade tomorrow. The Viking whose stories were woven into tapestry, still hanging on wall. The African warrior, dancing to drum rhythms until something inside finally loosened. The medieval knight, walking, one step at a time, towards something he can barely name but knows he needs to find. None of them were fixed in sense of returning exactly to what they were before. That would be impossible, and perhaps even undesirable. Because transformative experiences, even painful ones, especially painful ones, carry wisdom that can't be learned any other way. What they found wasn't forgetting, wasn't return to previous state. It was something more nuanced, more real. It was integration. It was learning to carry weight differently, no longer crushing, but distributed, like well-adjusted backpack instead of uneven burden throwing you off balance with each step. And what made this possible was never solitary effort. It was always complex weaving of elements working together. The silent presence of someone who understood. The comforting rhythm of work with hands. The relief of seeing others walk this path before and found way out. The structure of rituals saying there's beginning, middle, end to this transition. The vastness of sky or sea or mountain reminding you're part of something infinitely larger. The gentle touch of caring hands. The story being told until finding form that could be carried more lightly. It wasn't one thing. It was everything together. Like symphony where each instrument contributes to greater harmony. And as we lie here, in soft darkness of room, as mind finally begins to slow after this long journey through centuries and cultures, perhaps there's something comforting in realizing humanity always knew how to do this. Always knew how to help wounded find way back. Not always perfectly, not always completely. But knowledge was there, transmitted generation to generation, refined through millennia of lived experience, methods changed with culture and era. But principles remained: time, community, ritual, nature, narrative, purpose. Multiple dimensions being addressed simultaneously. The belief, grounded in observation, not naive optimism, that transformation was possible. And perhaps most comforting of all, the universal recognition that there's no shame in being wounded, that needing help isn't weakness, that taking time to process isn't character failure, that being human means sometimes being broken and sometimes needing to be carefully, patiently, lovingly put back together. Ancient cultures didn't see this as individual problem to be hidden or solved in isolation, saw it as part of fabric of communal life. You go, you fight, you return different. And we, as community, have structures ready to receive you, to help you make transition, to remind you who you are beyond what you went through. It wasn't perfect. There were failures, exceptions, people who fell through cracks even in those societies. We shouldn't romanticize past as if it were utopia. But there was wisdom there worth recognizing, worth preserving, worth perhaps adapting to our modern world that has so many advantages in other areas, but forgot some ancient truths about what it means to care for each other. And as this story reaches its end, as last echoes of African drums disappear into night, as last candle is extinguished in medieval chapel, as Viking bonfire burns down to embers, there's one last thing to leave with you. It's not solution, not easy answer. It's more like whisper. A gentle reminder you might need to hear, or perhaps someone you know needs to hear. The path back to yourself is possible, always has been. Will it be difficult? Probably. Will it take time? Certainly. Will you need help? Absolutely, but the path exists. It's been walked by countless others before you. It's being walked by others right now, this exact moment, and it will be available for whoever comes after. You're not alone in this. Never were. You're part of ancient lineage of humans who were wounded and who found somehow way to continue, not because they were special or exceptionally strong, but because they had time, had structures, had communities, had practices that facilitated healing. And these things, time, structure, community, practice, still exist. They may look different now, may require more effort to find in fragmented, accelerated world, but they're there. And you deserve to access them. You deserve care. You deserve patience. You deserve to believe there are future chapters in your story that can be good, even joyful, even carrying weight of past chapters. Ancient civilizations taught us this, not through words, but through consistent practice across millennia. They showed us that healing isn't linear, isn't fast, doesn't erase what happened, but it's real and it's possible. What a journey, isn't it? If you enjoyed traveling with us through these stories, consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations like this. And if you have any reflections, something that touched you, share in the comments. Sometimes it's comforting to know others are also making their own journeys. And then, as breathing slows and body finally relaxes, as mind that's been so active begins to quiet, let this final image land softly. A road, doesn't matter where, could be anywhere, anytime. It's empty at moment, bathed in soft light of dawn or dusk, hard to say which. The light is golden, gentle. The road extends in both directions, disappearing in gentle curves. Behind, the path already walked, marked by footprints, by memories, by experiences that can't be undone. This path is part of you now, always will be. Ahead, the path not yet walked, unknown. Perhaps a bit scary, but also full of possibilities, full of sunrises you haven't seen yet, of encounters that haven't happened, of versions of yourself that don't exist yet but are waiting patiently to emerge. And here, at this exact point where past meets future, you are. Resting, breathing, being. You don't need to decide anything now. Don't need to solve anything. Don't need to be anything beyond what you are in this moment. The path will be there tomorrow and the day after, and always, when you're ready, in your own time, at your own pace. For now, just rest. You made long journey today, through Rome, through Mongolia, through Japan, through all these places and times. You witnessed countless stories of wounding and healing. You saw it's possible, and tomorrow, if you want, you can take one more step on your own path. Just one. That's enough. Always was enough. The road continues, always continues, and you're on it. And that by itself is something. Sleep well. You're safe. The world can wait until morning. And when you wake, if you remember something from this story, let it be this. The path back home, not the place, but the state of mind, is long. But it doesn't need to be walked alone. And it's been walked before, and will be walked again. And you, in this moment, are part of this ancient and honorable tradition of humans who were wounded and who chose, one day at a time, to keep walking. Good night. Sleep in peace. And when sun rises again, as it always does, you'll still be here. Still capable, still with choices, still with possibilities. The path continues, always continues.